If Mom doesn't sign today, I'll sign for her. My oldest son's voice sliced through the ICU like a blade, cutting across the beeps of the monitor. I lay there with the oxygen tube deep in my nose, the IV biting my wrist, watching my oldest daughter step up, lipstick cold on her mouth, placing a pen in my hand. Just sign, Mom. Everything will be fine. My youngest daughter stood behind her brother, head bowed like she was crying. But her eyes stayed glued to the folder titled Asset Transfer and Inheritance Rights. Beside them, a stranger in a black suit opened his briefcase and set a seal on the table, ready to witness the moment they took their mother's estate. I looked at my 3 children, feeling hollow. None of them knew I had seen this day coming. I let the pen drop and heard the dry clink as metal hit the blanket. 3 faces froze at once. Because they had no idea the paper they were trying to force me to sign today was something I had made, permanently void a month ago. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Loretta Mae Ellison, 69, a widow for 12 years, living alone by Cedar Lake, a small town outside Kentucky where morning fog rests on the water and sparrows trade songs with church bells. I used to be a counseling teacher, then spent more than 2 decades building Haven Ridge Retreat, a place for women who lost their husbands, helping them find trust and peace again. I'm not rich in the usual sense, but Haven Ridge is my life's work, my years of being a mother, a wife, a woman who stood back up after grief. Now, in these later years, I thought the worst thing would be loneliness, until I realized the deepest wounds can come from people who share your last name. I woke under the cold white lights of the ICU, lines running across my arms, needles buried in my vein like creeping roots. The heart monitor blinked steadily. Each beep a reminder I was still alive, even if I wasn't sure any of my 3 children actually wanted that. At the head of the bed, Colin spoke quietly with the man in the black suit looked like a notary. I couldn't catch every word, but I knew Colin's tone, firm, transactional, the voice he used in real estate deals, not when talking to his mother. "I've prepared the forms," the man said. "Once she signs, I'll notarize immediately." Tessa, my oldest, always the organizer, set the pen in my hand, her voice gently fake. "It's just paperwork, Mom. Sign so we can handle everything for you and you won't have to stress." And Jenna, the youngest, stood at the foot of the bed, eyes rimmed red, speaking softly like comfort. "We just want you to feel at peace, Mom. It's just one signature." I looked at each of them, 3 faces that used to be my pride, now as distant as strangers. The way they stood close, traded looks, and spoke to me with half-sweet, half-cold voices told me this wasn't their first conversation about it. They had a plan. And today, I was. The final checkbox on their contract. I tried to lift my hand, but my body was weak, my fingers shaking. I felt the cold pen in my palm. "Hold it for her," someone said, probably Tessa. Another hand pressed lightly on my wrist. I heard Colin sigh like he was waiting on a deal that had dragged on too long. Then Jenna's voice near my ear. "Just sign, Mom. This will make everything better." Her tone was sweet, but I could hear the emptiness in each word. I didn't sign. I let the pen fall. The tiny sound metal on blanket seemed to echo in the silent room. All 3 of them stopped. Colin bit his lip. Tessa frowned. Jenna looked down. The notary cleared his throat and politely closed his briefcase. No one said another word. Then Colin muttered, "What a waste of time." I watched them leave one by one. No goodbye, no hand squeeze. Just the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of my heart. I breathed slowly, feeling a pain in my chest that wasn't from my heart, but from somewhere else deeper, older. I once thought nothing could hurt me more than losing my husband. But today I understood, the greatest pain isn't losing the person you love, it's watching the ones you gave life to turn their backs on dignity. When the nurse came in, I pretended to sleep. I needed time to piece things together. The name Cedar Lake surfaced where I've lived nearly 30 years, where I built Haven Ridge Retreat, a place for widows. I turned it into a safe home where hundreds of women learned to stand again after loss. Haven Ridge is my life's devotion, my memories, and my husband Jack's, who passed 12 years ago. I once thought I'd pass it to my children so they could continue the work. I believed in their goodness until I realized the only thing they saw in Haven Ridge wasn't its worth, but its value on paper. A month ago, when my breath felt shorter each day, I quietly met with attorney Naomi Keats, who had helped with donations and estate matters before. I told her I feared that if I ever fell ill, my kids wouldn't ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" "But what are you leaving?" Naomi didn't look surprised. She just met my eyes and said, "If you want to protect what you built, do it before they realize you're still clear-minded enough to act." The next day, I signed everything to transfer Haven Ridge Retreat to the Widow's Lantern Foundation, an independent nonprofit serving women who've lost loved ones. From that moment, Haven Ridge was no longer personal property. It belonged to the people who needed it most. None of my 3 children knew. I didn't plan to tell them, at least not yet. I still hoped I could find a bit of trust in them before revealing the truth. But tonight, when I heard Colin order, "Bring the notary in," I knew my silence had saved me. After they left, I lay still for a long time. The fluorescent light cast a cold glow, my shadow pooling on the white blanket. In the steel frame's reflection, my face looked pale, older than it should. But in my own eyes, I recognized something I'd lost: resolve. I'm no longer the mother who keeps her head down, afraid to lose her children's love. I'm Loretta, the woman who built a house of peace from the wreckage of her life. And I won't let anyone turn that legacy into a bargaining chip. I turned toward the IV line, took a deep breath, and whispered through a rough throat, "Kids, I've already prepared." When the nurse returned to adjust the machines, I closed my eyes again. But my mind was sharp with every word and step I'd take once I got out. I would document everything: the times, the words, the actions of each of them, so no one could twist the story. They think I'm just a confused old woman, a name on paperwork that's easy to replace. But they forgot, I'm the one who wrote all of this, and only I have the right to write the ending. The door they think opens to treasure has been locked for a long time. I hid the key where they'd never think to look: a place called justice. And when I leave this hospital, they'll learn that what they just tried to take hasn't been theirs for a long time. That afternoon, exactly 1 month before I was in that hospital bed, the lake was still as glass. I stood at the second-floor window, where late light spread like a gold cloth over the water. The pink-red glow slid across the pines and bounced off the glass, throwing back a face I knew yet felt distant: mine, more tired than ever. At 69, I've gotten used to my body slowing down. Every morning, climbing the stairs from the office to my small apartment above, my chest felt like an invisible hand was squeezing. The light pains on the left side came more often. At first I called it fatigue. I used to teach others to listen to their bodies, and when it was my turn, I pretended I couldn't hear. I kept moving, kept working, kept being strong, like it was my job. From that room, I could see the whole of Haven Ridge Retreat, the last 20 years of my life. White-painted cottages ringed the lavender garden, a gravel porch where widows meditated or journaled every morning. At the end of the stone path was the common room, the heart of Haven Ridge, where I brewed tea, baked, and listened as they spoke of their dead. Some sat in silence an hour and then burst into tears for the husband they lost. I sat beside them, saying nothing, just holding a hand. Sometimes comfort isn't words, it's someone patient enough to sit with you. I believed Haven Ridge was my life's calling. I led so many women through their darkest days, yet in that evening light, looking over the still water, I realized I was the one who hadn't left grief. I'd lived 2 decades among tears, lost stories, and memories of Jack who died on a snowy February morning. I built Haven Ridge to heal others, but accidentally locked myself inside a house of sorrow. I sat at the window desk and opened my laptop. The inbox overflowed, thank you notes from former guests, donor invites, financial reports, event newsletters. I skimmed past everything and stopped at drafts. One title glowed, Widow's Lantern. I'd typed it days ago and left it. The body held one sentence, I'm ready to do something that isn't about grief anymore. I don't remember why I wrote it, only that tears slid down before I noticed. Deep down, I knew I was tired of carrying everyone else's meaning, tired of being the strong one. That afternoon, Renee Porter stopped by. She's 58, Haven Ridge's director of care, the person I trust most. She set a warm box of waffles on my desk and smiled. Working this late again? I know you haven't eaten. I brushed it off, but she didn't. She sat and looked me straight in the eye. Loretta, I'm serious. You look weaker. Every time you climb the stairs, you grab the rail. You can't keep this up. I wanted to wave it away, say I was fine. But I saw real worry in her eyes. She lost her husband to cancer, tried to be tough the way I am now. She knows the price of caring for everyone else while forgetting yourself. She spoke slowly, like she didn't want me to fight her. It's time to rest, Loretta. Not because you're weak, because you've done enough. I was quiet. Outside, the light tilted. The lake turned amber. I watched the willows throw shadows on the water and thought of Jack. He planted them years ago, saying they'd grow up with Haven Ridge. They're tall now, shading the path. And I, the planter, have started to slow down, to drain out. Renee, I said softly, if I'm not here one day, what happens to Haven Ridge? She didn't answer right away. She set her hand on the desk and gently squeezed mine. I don't know. But I do know that if you collapse suddenly, this place loses its soul. The words tightened my chest. I knew. Better than anyone, Haven Ridge revolved around me. I signed every decision, approved every project, held every license. I meant to build a home for community, but I'd made it dependent on one person, me. That evening after Renee left, I sat in the dim until the hallway lights clicked on. I reopened the Widow's Lantern draft and stared at that single sentence. Screen light lifted the lines at my eyes. Maybe it was time to let Haven Ridge become something bigger than me, beyond a mother, a widow, a worn-out founder. I didn't want it to die with me. I wanted it to live after me. When I left, I paused at the main gate. The wooden sign had darkened with age. A breeze carried lavender and damp wood. From inside came laughter, women learning joy again. I closed my eyes and let that sound pass through like a goodbye. I knew something was different that evening. Not just the light, an unmistakable feeling that a chapter was closing. In the car, sunset flared in the rearview, almost too bright. I suddenly felt this might be my last time seeing Haven Ridge this way as an owner. Next time, it would be a legacy, no longer under my name. Back at my lakeside house, the light gilded the water. Tiny waves tossed gold onto the porch. I parked but didn't shut off the engine. In that moment, I knew, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving without protecting what matters. I went inside, switched on the lamp, opened my laptop, and found Naomi Keats's number, the attorney who'd helped with last year's charitable paperwork. My cursor hovered before I called. Loretta? I thought you'd clocked out for the day, she answered gently. Not yet, Naomi, I said. I'm just getting started. That night, I knew my decision was set. Under the warm desk light, I wrote one line in my notebook. Tomorrow, I'll give Haven Ridge to the people who need it before my children take it. Outside, the night had settled. A thin moon skimmed the lake. The glow was soft but steady, just like the feeling inside me. Quiet, not weak. I knew that evening's sun was the sign of a beginning. The next morning I got to Haven Ridge earlier than usual. Fog still hugged Cedar Lake. The path in felt so still I could hear my shoes crunch the gravel. It was familiar and foreign, like walking through my own memory. Papers from the night before waited on my desk. I poured black tea, sat, and opened my contacts. Naomi's name appeared, note beneath it, Attorney Charitable and Community Assets. I took a long breath and called. "Loretta, I've been expecting you," Naomi said, warm but professional. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," I said calmly. "I want a foundation not owned by anyone. It will carry on what Haven Ridge began." That afternoon I drove to Naomi's office in Lexington. Autumn leaves drifted over the hood, and I thought of what's fallen from my hands in this life. My husband, my youth, and now my trust in my children. But amid the losses, there was something I could still keep meaning. Naomi greeted me with a light smile and serious eyes that felt trustworthy. She poured coffee and spread clean pages across the table. "What will we call it?" she asked. I looked out the window at the rising sun flashing on the glass. I thought of the little candle we lit at memorials in Haven Ridge, the one cradled by widows' hands, symbolizing hope and strength after loss. "Widow's Lantern Foundation," I said. "The flame isn't just for the dead. It's for the living learning to go on." Naomi nodded and took notes. "We worked for hours." She explained each clause: transfer of ownership, board structure, nonprofit bylaws, independent authority. I listened, noted, and signed each page like a farewell to a piece of my life. 2 witnesses came, Renee Porter, my trusted colleague, and Victor Lane, our longtime accountant. Both understood the weight of this moment and stayed quiet. No, one asked why. Only Renee's glances seemed to ask, "Are you sure?" I nodded. When Naomi finished the last clause, she looked up and said clearly, "As of today, all assets, land rights, facilities, and operational authority of Haven Ridge Retreat are legally transferred to the Widow's Lantern Foundation. No shares remain in your name, Loretta. More importantly, none are in your children's names." I went still. It felt like a seal pressed onto my old life. I was both relieved and empty, the same feeling as when I took off my wedding ring for the last time after Jack died. Part of my heart was released, the other part knew nothing would be the same. Naomi closed the file and slid me a notarized copy. "Keep this safe. I recommend a separate storage location, physical and digital, and tell no one until you truly want to." I smiled. "I understand. Some silences protect what's right." That evening it rained lightly in Cedar Lake. I turned on the lamp, opened the wall, safe I'd had installed, and placed every document transfer papers, foundation confirmations, witness list, bylaws into a moisture-proof envelope and locked it away. Then I photographed everything and uploaded it to a private cloud folder only Naomi and I could access. Holding those papers, I thought of my 3 children. Tessa, who calls herself the best manager in the family, Colin, who sees Haven Ridge as an asset with growth potential, and Jenna, the gentle youngest who quietly sides with the stronger voice. I love them, maybe always will, but trust between us cracked long ago. I once thought I could tell them that forming the foundation was to protect our family's work. Then I understood. When love is mixed with greed, explanations become kindling. I didn't tell them, not out of secrecy, but because the timing wasn't safe. Some decisions, if revealed too soon, are twisted before they can take root. I reminded myself, love doesn't mean handing over unconditional power. I'd raised them with such plenty they believed everything was theirs by default. Today, I'm relearning love, clear-eyed love that protects what must be protected. At 9 p.m., I closed the laptop and leaned back. The desk lamp threw my faint reflection onto the rain-streaked window, brown silver hair, lines like a map of time. A flicker of fear, If I don't wake up tomorrow, will anyone understand I did this not out of selfishness but to safeguard value? Then I smiled. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing the right thing while fear sits beside you. I drew the curtains and listened to rain on glass. The yellow light warmed the quiet room like a promise. I wrote the day's last line in my journal. Tonight I locked the door they'll try to pry open. I'm keeping the key, not to hide, but to wait for the right knock. Before bed, I typed a short email to the interim board of the Widow's Lantern Foundation Naomi's nominees. 2. Community psychologists, an independent financial advisor, and Renee Porter. I've completed the transfer. This foundation doesn't belong to me. It belongs to those who will need it. I am the starter, not the holder. I hit send. The tiny message sent successfully banner brought a strange swell in my chest, part sorrow, part peace. Outside, the rain eased. A silver streak skimmed the lake, reflecting the porch light. I closed the door slowly, carrying a quiet I hadn't felt in years. That night, Cedar Lake drowned in mist. I stood at the window, watched water run down the glass, and told myself, from now on, Havenridge isn't mine. But it will live, and the light from the widow's lantern will go on even when I'm gone. I don't remember when I collapsed. Maybe in the office. Maybe by the kitchen doorway where I make morning tea. I only know that when I opened my eyes, the room was all harsh white light, steady beeps, and the sharp smell of disinfectant, like waking inside a cold dream. I wanted to ask what happened, but my throat burned and only a rasp came out. A young nurse noticed I was awake and ran to get the doctor. They said things like transient cardiac ischemia, a few days of monitoring, lucky it wasn't too late. I nodded so they'd be at ease, but my mind was on something else. Do my kids know I'm here? The answer came fast. That afternoon, the door swung open. 3 familiar faces, Colin, Tessa, Jenna. With them, a stranger in a black suit carrying a leather case. "Oh my, Mom, you're awake!" Tessa blurted, half surprised, half awkward. She set a tiny bouquet on the table, but I saw it was plastic, the kind you grab from the gift shop by the elevators. "The doctor says you're past the danger point," Colin said, voice hard like a revenue report. "But you need to rest and avoid stress, so it's best we settle everything now." I squinted. "Settle what?" Jenna slid a chair close, holding my hand, her voice small. "Just a little paperwork, Mom. We'll help manage Havenridge so you won't face legal issues." Before I could respond, Colin signaled to the man to open the case. The metal latch clicked cold as ice. A thick stack landed on the bedside table. "This is a temporary power of attorney," Colin said. "Sign, and we'll handle the banks, donors, and agencies. You won't have to worry." I stared at the page's tiny print, signature tabs already marked. My eyes blurred, but instinct made me sharper than ever. This wasn't temporary. It was permanent. We should do it quickly. "Mom's weak," Tessa coaxed, voice so persuasive it felt foreign. "The notary is here. It'll take minutes." The man nodded. I felt the IV pinch, my throat close. The heart rate on the monitor ticked like a warning. I tried to speak, but couldn't. My breath caught. My hand went numb. Colin lowered his voice to the girls. "Just get it done. She can't fight it. If we don't do it now, later will be too late." Tessa pressed the pen into my hand. "Just sign, Mom. You've worked your whole life." "Let us take it from here." Jenna leaned closer, sweetness turning false. "Sign, Mom, so you can relax." I heard every word, every breath. My 3 kids, the ones who once argued over slices of my pie and called me a superhero when I kept us afloat after their dad died, now stood here not to care for me, but to take. I tried to lift my hand and only managed to hold the pen loosely. I felt a sting at the IV site and a chill rushing up my arm. Through the haze, I heard Tessa murmur, Hold Mom's hand steady. Jenna's hand landed on my wrist, soft but firm. Colin stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes indifferent. I let the pen fall. A small, dry click on white fabric. No one spoke for a few seconds. The air felt sucked out of the room. Colin inhaled hard and dropped a flat line. Fine. If you don't want to, then rest. But don't say we didn't take care of things. Tessa picked up the pen and slipped it into her purse. She said, "Let's go," without looking back. Jenna was the last to step out, gently closing the door. I saw her lashes tremble, but I couldn't tell if it was from nerves or guilt. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone under the cold white lights and the steady beeps of the heart monitor. No scent of flowers, only antiseptic. I lay still as tears burned down my temples. I wasn't crying from weakness. I cried because I had seen this coming, and I had prepared for it. 3 days later, I could sit up. They removed the oxygen tube. A nurse helped me practice breathing and eat thin porridge. My body still hurt, but my mind was strangely clear. I asked to borrow a phone to call family, but I really wanted to call Renee. When she heard my voice, she froze. "Oh my God, Loretta, I just heard you got sick." And before I could get there, Colin called the office this morning. I gripped the phone. "What did he say?" "He said you're not well enough to work and that you agreed to let him temporarily run Haven Ridge. He said staff might need to help sign a few things while you recover." I closed my eyes and breathed deep. Anger rose, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I just felt sorry for the blindness that greed can plant in the children you raised. "Renee," I said softly, "I want everything left as is. No transfers, no new accounts, no one enters the office without me, okay?" "Of course," she answered quickly, firm. "I'll tell accounting and the team. They only take direction from you." I smiled weakly. "Thank you. And one more thing, remember, Haven Ridge isn't mine anymore. It belongs to the Widow's Lantern Foundation. All documents were transferred 3 weeks ago." There was a pause, then Renee gave a small laugh. "So you already did it. I had a feeling." "Yeah, I said. "I just didn't think I'd see this day so soon." After the call, I asked the nurse to bring my handbag from the locker. I took out my phone and opened my private cloud folder. Everything was intact: signed PDFs, confirmation minutes, notarized copies. I opened a new note and typed slowly. June 4th, ICU. Colin brought a notary. Tessa assisted. Jenna present. Tried to force a power of attorney while patient on IV, not fully capable. I did not sign. No consent. No legal authorization. I saved the file, titled it ICU Forced Signature, and uploaded a copy to my backup cloud. Then I attached it to an email and sent it to Renee with the subject line, "In case needed." I set the phone down, leaned back on the pillow, and breathed deep. In the quiet room, I could hear the rain on the window and my heartbeat slow, steady. I wasn't a woman lost in illness anymore. I had recorded my first piece of evidence, a legal fence strong enough to protect what I've built. I stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent light glinting off the IV line. Everything looked white, but inside me, a different light was growing. I knew that from this moment on, their efforts would be pointless. The door they're trying to open, I locked it long ago with keys called Law and Clarity. And I swore that once I left this room, I would never let anyone sign for me, never again. 3 days later, the doctor signed my discharge. He spoke gently but firmly. "Mrs. Loretta, your heart almost stopped. If you stay under stress or hide symptoms again, you won't be this lucky next time." I only smiled. To me, it wasn't an accident, it was a wake-up call. My body spoke before my spirit collapsed. Renee picked me up in her old silver car. She climbed out with my wool cardigan I'd left at the office and a small paper bag with hot soup, chamomile tea, and a few cookies. Seeing it made my heart sink, a simple care that didn't demand repayment. No contract, no. Terms, no signature. Just honest kindness. On the drive back to Cedar Lake, we barely spoke. Fog hung thick, catching the weak sunlight on every branch. I sat in the back seat, holding my medical file tight. The engine's hum was lulling, but my mind couldn't rest. In those 3 ICU days, I had repeated a list in my head what to do once I got home. When the car stopped at my house, I took a long breath. The small lakeside home was as quiet as the day I left, except the wind carried the damp smell of early autumn leaves. Renee helped me in, made tea, and reminded me, rest and don't touch work. I nodded, thanked her, waited for her to clear the driveway, then locked the door and pulled the key. The first thing I did wasn't rest. I went straight to the living room, bent down, and opened the cabinet under the bookshelf where the backup safe was hidden. The code still worked. When the soft click sounded, I almost held my breath. Inside, the original deeds transferring. Haven Ridge to the Widow's Lantern Foundation were stacked neatly, along with 2 witness confirmations and minutes from the interim board meeting. Nothing had moved. I carefully photographed each page, numbered them, and saved them to a hard drive in a separate cloud only Naomi Keats and I could access. Then I put everything back and locked the safe with a new code. This time I added another character, one more layer of comfort. I stood and looked around. Everything familiar, yet distant. This home once echoed with my kids' voices at Christmas. Now only wind slipped through the doorframe. I sat on the sofa and checked my phone. 3 new messages. Tessa, rest up, Mom, don't overthink. I'll visit soon. Colin, let's talk this weekend, Mom. A few things need your confirmation. Jenna, not a word. I stared at the 3 lines, and a chill ran through me. Each text sounded caring, but I heard the voice of interest and the patience of a plan not yet complete. I set the phone down and poured more tea. The chamomile rose light and sweet, but it couldn't lift the weight in my chest. That afternoon, I opened my laptop to check the work inbox. Hundreds of unread emails. One subject jumped out. Legal advisory appointment confirmation. I opened it. My heart thudded. It read, appointment between Loretta Ellison and legal advisor for Haven Ridge Retreat confirmed for 10 o'clock Friday morning. Below it was an electronic signature from Colin. He had impersonated me. Attached was a draft temporary power of attorney, the same thing I refused to sign in the ICU. Maybe any parent knows the unique pain of being betrayed by your own child. I still ask myself, do you believe love has limits? Tell me how you feel in the comments. I read each one like a new chapter in this life. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, and opened them again. No trembling, no fear, just a cold clarity. I hit forward and sent it to the entire interim board of the Widow's Lantern Foundation. In the body, I wrote, please reconfirm the governance structure. As of May 12th, all management authority for Haven Ridge Retreat belongs solely to the Widow's Lantern Foundation. No member of my family holds any position or legal authority. Any requests or contacts contrary to policy should be reported to me and attorney Naomi Keats. I attached the organizational charter, signed electronically, and sent it. When message sent successfully appeared, I exhaled. Once more, the door they tried to pry shut itself tighter. Evening came on. Late light streamed through the window onto the wooden table where I keep my old notebook. The cover was worn, the first pages still stained with old coffee. I opened it and wrote, clearly, June 4th ICU. Colin called a notary, brought power of attorney papers. Tessa assisted. Jenna stood by. They said Mom should sign for peace of mind. I did not sign. Then Colin left, irritated. Tessa packed the files. Jenna said nothing. All remembered. I paused, dotted the page, then added, I never thought I'd have to write this. But it's necessary to protect the truth if I can't speak. I closed the notebook, pulled a separate page, an action list, and numbered it. 1. Call Naomi Keats, confirm Haven Ridge's legal status. 2. Notify the board about Colin's impersonation. 3. Contact installers, set up a home camera system. 4. Update medical directive, remove decision rights from the kids. 5. Change emergency contact to Renee and Naomi. 6. Cancel the old power of attorney I granted years ago. Each time I finished a line, I drew a firm stroke through it. It felt like locking every door and sealing every gap they might slip through. I worked until dark, the warm lamp spreading a soft band across the table. Outside, the lake caught the distant glow of neighbors' lights. I stood, pulled the curtains, and saw my reflection in the glass, small but steady. Before bed, I wrote another letter by hand. Thick cream paper, my handwriting shaky but clear. Dear Naomi, if one day I lose capacity, open this envelope. Inside are journals, notes, and legal evidence of my children's recent actions. I trust you to protect the truth. Sincerely, Loretta M. Ellison. I sealed it and wrote on the front, open only if Loretta loses capacity. I placed it in the wall safe with a copy of my ID and an asset list. Done. I turned off the lights, leaving a small one on the bookshelf. In the quiet house, the ticking clock sounded like the heartbeat of resolve. I wrapped myself in the cardigan Renee brought and sat by the window, looking out at the dark lake. Everything seemed asleep, but I knew the real fight had just begun. And this time, I would not fight with tears, but with evidence, with the law, and with the calm of a mother who used to trust too easily and has finally learned to trust herself. That Sunday, the Cedar Lake sky was cold and gray, no sun, just a breeze through the pines by the porch. I just poured tea when I heard an engine settle in the driveway, the low growl of a black SUV, the kind Colin uses for important meetings. My heart beat slow, not surprised. I knew the vague discussion from their weekend texts had arrived. The engine cut, doors opened in near unison. Colin stepped out first, white shirt buttoned to the collar, dark suit, shoes polished to a mirror in the dim noon light. He adjusted his tie, the habit he has before a deal. With Colin, everything is transactional, including family. Behind him came Tessa, hair in a tight bun, sunglasses covering half her face, though there was no sun. On her left was Jenna, the youngest, carrying a reusable water bottle, soft sweater, expression calm to the point of artificial. Watching them approach my door felt less like a visit to Mom and more like a shareholders' meeting. I opened the door before they could knock. "Come in," I said evenly. Colin walked straight in without a greeting. Tessa pressed her lips together. Jenna tried a stiff smile. They sat on the sofa while I stayed standing, keeping distance. "We need to talk," Colin began, placing a navy folder on the coffee table and sliding it toward me with a deliberate calm. "Just a few items to review: power of attorney, medical decision rights, co-managed accounts, and a shared benefit structure for Haven Ridge. We've organized everything." I looked at the stack and didn't touch it. Light from the window flashed off the cover stamped "Legal Draft." I didn't need to open it to know what was inside, a replay of what they tried in the hospital. Tessa leaned in, voice smooth like a presentation. "This is just temporary, so things stay stable. If it feels unnecessary later, you can revoke it." Jenna, beside her, dipped her head and added softly, "If you sign, everyone can relax. I know you're tired, but this is for everyone's good." I stayed silent. In that moment, I could hear the wall clock tick, each second dropping into the air. I reached out and pulled the folder close, opened the first tab. Dense legal phrases stared back: durable power of attorney, shared asset authorization, healthcare decision rights highlighted in yellow, ready for a signature. I turned each page slowly. It felt like reading an indictment written by my own children. At the last page, I closed it, set it back where it was, and said plainly, "No." Colin arched a brow. You haven't read it fully. I've read enough, I said, calm, low, but clear. The answer is no. The room froze. Tessa glanced at Colin, signaling. He leaned back and shifted tone. I don't think you're fully clear-headed. The doctor said you need rest and no stress. Are you sure you understand everything that's happening? I looked him in the eye. I'm clear enough to know trust has broken, and once it's broken, no. Paperwork fixes it. Jenna squeezed her bottle and stared down. Tessa exhaled sharply, trying to stay composed, fingers rubbing the purse edge, eyes unsteady. Colin braced his elbows on his knees, leaning toward me. I don't want to argue, but you're making this harder. This is about Havenridge, the family's asset. If you keep this stance, I'll have to find another way to protect it. Understood? I answered slowly, each word touching the air. Colin, Havenridge doesn't need protection from me. It needs protection from my children's greed. Silence fell. Outside, a draft lifted the curtain. I stood and walked to the door. This conversation ends here, I said, hand on the knob. If you truly want to care for me, start by respecting my answer. Tessa shot up. You're just pushing us away. You've changed. You're not the mom I knew. I turned back, eyes gentle but firm. Maybe you never knew who I really was. You only knew the mother who yielded, nodded, and endured. She's gone. The room went quiet. Jenna leaned forward like she might speak, then stopped. Colin grabbed his briefcase, face set like stone. Through his teeth, he said, "We won't give up." I nodded lightly. I know. Then I opened the door. My 3 children walked out without looking back. The door shut with a small, dry click that echoed. A boundary had been drawn between love and control, between the mother they were used to and the woman they can't bend. I stood a few seconds with my hand on the knob, listening as the SUV's engine faded down the leaf-strewn road. When the sound was gone, I let go and headed to the kitchen. On the counter, my morning tea had gone cold. I added hot water. The scent rose and drifted into the quiet. With both hands around the mug, I noticed they were shaking, but not from fear. For the first time in years, they trembled with relief. Not relief from winning, but from choosing my voice over. Compliance. I no longer needed to keep the peace, no longer needed to use endurance as a shield. I sat and looked out the window. Cedar Lake mirrored thin clouds. Nothing outside had changed, but I knew everything inside me had. I had stepped across a line, not loud, not dramatic, just a steady no, strong enough to reclaim the rest of my life. And sometimes a woman's greatest strength isn't in the shout, it's in the moment she smiles and looks straight at the people telling her to be quiet. Last Sunday was the boundary line, and Monday morning the mailman brought the first strike. On the porch lay a large white envelope stamped with the law firm Colin likes to hire. I used a letter opener. Inside, an emergency petition for guardianship filed in County Family Court. Petitioner, Colin Ellison. Supporter, Tessa. Witness, Jenna. The summary was cold as stone. Mrs. Loretta is unstable, easily influenced, needs a representative. I read it all, closed it, and set it on the table like closing a door. I didn't call the kids. I dialed Naomi Keats. Loretta, I expected this, Naomi said evenly. We respond now. I don't want a circus, I said, but I won't hand myself to greed. Then we use facts, she replied. Start with a timeline. That afternoon, I brought my notebook, phone, and a box of files to Naomi's office. On the glass board, she wrote key points: ICU, June 4th, impersonation email, Havenridge transfer May 12th, cameras 2 weeks ago. I provided the texts: Tessa's rest up, Colin's talk this weekend, and Jenna's silence. Naomi nodded. Silence, after a forced signature attempt, is still data. We pulled images of the originals, transfer deeds, witness confirmations. I opened the cloud note. ICU force signature. Colin brought a notary. Tessa assisted. Jenna present. Patient on IV. No signature. Naomi asked me to write a first-person statement describing sounds, words, feelings. Courts don't just read statutes, she said. They read people. The next day, Naomi contacted Haven Ridge. Renee sent gate camera footage. Colin tried to badge into operations and was stopped by security. We numbered, time-stamped, and indexed the exhibits. Naomi concluded, "The strategy is to show a systematic manipulation pattern, impersonation, staging, exploiting illness, attempted facility access." I nodded, heart steadying. I got home late. On the porch sat a tray of banana bread wrapped in parchment with a note, "Eat and rest. I stopped by but missed you. Jenna." The smell of ripe banana, butter, and cinnamon pulled me back to when she baked with me. I didn't open the door. I didn't text back. I set the tray in the kitchen and covered it. Love isn't dead, but it no longer drives my decisions. That night I wrote a small declaration in my journal, saying no isn't cruel, saying no is building a fence around the replay day. A heart, so love isn't used as a shortcut to the vault. When I set down the pen, my breath felt lighter. In the days that followed, we sprinted. Naomi prepared a thick response, a motion to dismiss, a statement from my cardiologist, confirming capacity, the new medical directive, my cancellation of the old power of attorney, a letter from the Widow's Lantern Board confirming governance, and the full digital log. I checked every error, questioned every comma. Naomi smiled. "I appreciate your precision." Friday afternoon, the response was filed. On the courthouse steps, Naomi said, "From here, you shift from defense to offense. They shoved us onto the field. Now we choose the rules." The words clicked a latch in my chest. That weekend, I cleaned house like a recovery ritual. I gathered old magazines, reset picture frames, wiped sills, each drawer arranged like an argument. Orderly, clear, no room for clutter. I opened windows to let fall air in, damp wood mixing with lemon. Oil. I brought in the wind chimes. I no longer needed to fill the silence with noise. At night, I didn't stand guard. Passing cars didn't startle me. Shadows across the lawn didn't send me to the curtains. Under warm light, I reread our filing, holding it like a map. I know where I am and where I'm going. Sunday morning, I carried the bread to the porch. The top had dried, but the scent remained. I cut a slice and brewed tea. I wasn't angry at Jenna, just sad she stood on the fence so long. Sad, but not weak. I bagged the rest and texted Renee, "Pick up when you can. Give to the night shift." I don't eat much sugar. An hour later, the tray was gone, with a note left behind. "Got it. R." At noon, Naomi called. "Court received it. Preliminary hearing next week." "I'll send the schedule." I thanked her and set the phone down. Out in the yard, I clipped lavender and set it in a chipped ceramic vase. The scent filled the kitchen and seeped down the hall. I understood that for years I fed life in others while forgetting to feed life in my own home. Toward evening, I dragged an old cedar chest to the center of the living room. Inside, Jack's letters, cassette tapes of the kids singing, receipts from Haven Ridge's opening days. I didn't burn or toss them. I organized, tied fresh ribbon, and labeled, "Keep not for bargaining. Keep what needs keeping. Let go of the rest. That's how I'll live again." The sun dropped behind the pines. The house washed in a soft blue. I flipped on the porch light, its glow falling across the gray stone path. I realized I wasn't afraid of footsteps anymore. If anyone comes, this door opens on my terms. Inside, there is order. Inside, there is a fence. Night settled. I sat at the table and wrote one more line. I won't prove anything with tears. I'll prove it with timestamps, names, signatures. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for respect. My peace doesn't hang on someone else's mood. Wind drifted off the lake. I closed the journal and dimmed the lights, leaving one in the kitchen. That small glow pushed back just enough dark like the widow's lantern I named the foundation after. I walked room to room, touching the wood, listening to the house breathe. In that rhythm, I knew I'd left the fragile shore and stepped onto the solid one. The next morning, the mailman knocked again. No heavy envelope this time, just ads. I brewed tea and opened a window. The Cedar Lake sky was clearer than usual. In my chest, space opened not to run, but to move forward. That morning, the sky over Cedar Lake was startlingly clear. I stood at the mirror and smoothed the sleeves of my navy coat, the one I wore at those first Haven Ridge fundraisers, when I could drive across 3 states to raise support for widows with nowhere to go. I chose it not to look strong, but to remember who I am, the woman who once stood at a podium and spoke plainly about value, trust, and how a woman can rebuild her life with 2 trembling hands. The county courthouse sits downtown, a small red brick building with an old dome. Inside, early light streamed through tall windows and lay across the wooden benches like a thin layer of time. I walked slowly, each step treading on years of wounds caused by my own kin. Colin was already there with his attorney, dark suit, composed face like he was the one responsible for everything. Tessa sat beside him, flipping through files. Jenna kept her head down, fingers intertwined, avoiding my eyes. I took a breath and sat across from them next to Naomi. "You okay?" she whispered. "I am," I said. "I just want to hear everything clearly this time and not let anyone speak over my voice." When the judge entered, everyone stood. She was a woman in her early 60s, gray hair in a neat bun, eyes stern but not cold. Her voice was soft yet firm. Temporary guardianship, hearing the matter of Colin Ellison versus Loretta Mae Ellison. On the other side, Colin's attorney stood first and opened the file. His voice was smooth, precise, with a hint of fake regret. "Your Honor, my client only wants to protect his mother. Recently, she has shown signs of cognitive decline and is easily influenced by outsiders, especially Haven Ridge staff. Her decision to transfer all assets to a non-profit run by others indicates impaired judgment." Each word "decline," easily influenced, dropped and made my chest heavier, but my face stayed calm. I didn't need to argue with emotion. I only needed the facts. When it was our turn, Naomi rose. She didn't raise her voice. She just opened each file and presented them in order. "Your Honor, we submit medical records from Cedar Lake Hospital confirming that Mrs. Loretta has no signs of cognitive disorder. Her cardiac condition is stable, and her reflexes and logical reasoning are fully intact." She pulled up a slide on the small screen. A photo of me in the ICU with an IV, and at the bedside, Colin and 2 women images taken from the hospital camera. She continued, steady. "We are also submitting notes, Mrs. Loretta recorded herself, auto-saved to the cloud at the time of the incident. It states, Colin brought a notary, tried to force a power of attorney while the patient was on an IV, no consent." A small camera click sounded from the back row. I glanced at my son, his face unchanged, but his hands were clenched, knuckles white. Naomi moved to the 3rd piece of evidence. Security footage at Haven Ridge on May 22nd shows Mr. Colin Ellison attempting to use an employee badge to enter the administrative area despite having his access revoked. "We have a written security report." She paused, then unfolded a sheet of paper and read each word clearly. "From Mrs. Loretta's letter to the Widow's Lantern Foundation board. The court doesn't need to protect me from strangers, but from my play. Family's illusion of inheritance rights." The courtroom went silent. Only the judge's pen tapped the bench. I saw Jenna turn away, her shoulders trembling slightly. Tessa sat straighter, lips pressed tight, and Colin stared at the table like a man calculating his next move. The judge signaled for me to stand. "Mrs. Loretta, would you like to speak before we recess for deliberation?" I stood with my hands lightly clasped, steadying myself. The room felt smaller, only breath and heartbeat left. I spoke slowly, each sentence clear. I didn't come here to fight over anything. I only want the peace I worked my whole life to have. I am clear-minded. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I don't need anyone to decide for me. I'm not afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of being lived for by people who no longer see me as a person, but as an inheritance. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the wood-paneled room. The judge looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Loretta." She called a brief recess and then announced, "The court will recess to review all evidence. A written ruling will be issued in the coming days." When the gavel tapped softly, I drew a deep breath. I didn't feel victorious, and I didn't feel afraid. I just felt steady in the truest sense. Not standing on arguments, but on my own name. Across the aisle, Colin packed his files without a word. Tessa avoided my eyes. Jenna walked slowly behind them, glancing back once eyes wet, half wanting to speak, half afraid to. I gave a small nod. No hatred, no blame. I knew I couldn't save people who don't want to wake up. Outside, noonlight fell across the brick walkway. Naomi walked beside me in silence until we reached the lot. She set a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Whatever the outcome, you reclaimed your name today." I smiled. "And that name," I said, "won't be used to sign for anyone else again." 2 days later, the mailman came again. This time the envelope was thicker, but it didn't feel threatening. I sat at the kitchen table, poured tea, and opened it slowly. Cedar Lake County Court Notice of Ruling. After reviewing all evidence, the petitioner's emergency guardianship request is denied in full. The court notes indications of financial manipulation by involved individuals and refers the matter to civil authorities for further investigation. I set the letter on the table and watched the steam rise from my tea. No gloating, no tension, just a thin but true line of peace running through me. I murmured to myself, "No one can give you your freedom back if you don't unlock it yourself." Midday light came through the window and fell across the page with my name in bold, no strike-throughs, no footnotes. I ran a hand over the words, Loretta Mae Ellison. For the first time in months, I felt my name whole again, not in a complaint, not on a power of attorney form, not in a guardianship file, but in my actual life. I folded the letter and set it beside the warm cup. The mist of steam mixed with the early afternoon light, so light it was almost transparent. I knew the fight wasn't entirely over, but I had won the most important part. I was no longer a victim of my own blind love. I decided not to cancel Legacy Evening, the event I'd scheduled to honor those who had walked with Havenridge, but I changed the guest list. No Ellison name tags, and no donors who like posing with oversized checks. I pulled out my old address book, made calls, and handwrote invites to people who'd been overlooked when Havenridge got too glossy, the high school teachers in town, the retired nurses who once asked to borrow the common room for a support group but were turned away for not meeting criteria, the shelter coordinator for abused women, the one who emailed me 4 times and then gave up. On each card, I wrote the same line in a slightly shaky blue ink. Havenridge is no longer my family's asset. It belongs to those who need it. Hope to see you at Legacy Evening. Some called back right away, voices trembling with disbelief. Others sent a simple, "Thank you for remembering us," and some were silent for days before replying, as if they needed time to believe that a long-closed door had opened. I didn't push. A good door is one people choose to walk through. News of the ruling spread faster than I expected. Colin found out by late afternoon. 3 days before the event, he stood at the top of my driveway, hands in his pockets, no car, no briefcase, just a rare pale look. I opened the door and stood on the porch. He didn't ask to come in. "I want to ask one thing," he said, staring at a slash of sunlight on the step. Are you throwing away our family's shared vision? I answered. Our family never had a shared vision for Havenridge, Colin. You had a vision of assets. I had a vision of meaning. I paused, then said slowly, I no longer confuse love with blind loyalty. I did for too long. Colin pressed his lips until I could see his jaw go tight. He said nothing more, and turned away like a man who'd missed his train. I watched his shadow stretch across the grass, then break as he turned the corner. I felt no triumph, only calm, as if we had finally spoken in our real language. The language of boundaries. On Legacy evening, a soft wind moved over Cedar Lake. I arrived early to check the steel frame greenhouse out back where I wanted dinner to be. String lights looped above, reflecting in small glints on a long table draped in a sandy linen cloth. We laid out simple china and a well-worn set of flatware. No elaborate flowers, just a few sprigs of lavender and rosemary in rinsed jam jars. On each plate I placed a small handwritten note, "You belong here." It was almost blunt in its simplicity, but I wanted it unconditional. I've seen too many doors that say, "Welcome," with lines of fine print underneath. If, as long as, on the condition that Havenridge had been like that at times. Tonight I corrected it with one short sentence. Guests trickled in, then filled the room. A silver-haired teacher arrived with a boy whose chin carried a long scar. I remembered him nodding off in the meditation room after a week without a place to sleep. A retired nurse came with a cane and chose a chair near the window. The shelter coordinator came late, out of breath but smiling. Thank you for the invitation and for the acknowledgement. No family names on the list. I opened one door and closed another. When everyone was seated, I stepped to the small mic at the head of the table. I hadn't prepared a speech. I only knew there was one thing I needed to say, clearly. Tonight, I began, isn't to tally credit or blame, isn't to brag about what Havenridge has done or excuse what it hasn't. Tonight is so I can finally say what I should have said long ago. Havenridge is no longer my family's. The greenhouse went so quiet I could hear a draft slip under the door. I opened a brown envelope and took out the transfer deed and a fresh confirmation letter. My voice didn't shake. I officially announce the land and facilities of Havenridge have been transferred to the Cedar Lake Community Trust, an independent community fund. No inheritance, no reversal. No fine print, no back door. From today on, the key holder is this community. For a few seconds, nobody clapped. Not because they weren't glad, because respect rarely makes noise. Then slowly, one person stood. Then a second, a third. They didn't cheer or shout my name. They just stood with damp eyes and hands at their sides, as if greeting something that had been taken from them for too long. I bowed my head. I didn't need anything more. Dinner moved gently after that. Pumpkin soup, toasted bread, apple salad, simple dishes meant for sharing. I walked the aisles, nodding and touching the shoulders of people who had come to Havenridge on very hard days. A mailman told me his wife once sat upstairs in the library and read aloud their son's last letter from the service. A grandmother raising 2 grandkids said sometimes all she needed was a place to sit and cry without someone rushing a tissue into her hand to make her stop. In that moment I understood. I hadn't abandoned Havenridge. I had returned it to its rightful owners. When most guests had gone, I took one last walk to say goodbye to Havenridge, not the building, but the old version of myself there. I went into the library, low shelves, paper and pine. I rested my hand on the spine of On Grief and Grieving, remembering the line, "Loss isn't something to get over, it's something we learn to carry." I went down to the meditation room, gray mats, the sound of wind against glass. I sat on the floor, closed my eyes, and listened to my heartbeat. Then I climbed the wooden stairs, the ones that creaked every morning when I carried a hot mug past. The hall light cast a long yellow strip like a road from youth to now. "Thank you," I whispered as if to a friend. I turned out most of the lights and locked the door. The new keys belonged to the Cedar Lake Community Trust, but tonight I was the one to close up, just once more. Back home, the porch light fell across the kitchen counter. A small sealed envelope sat there with no name. I opened it. Inside was a single slip of paper, Tessa's handwriting clear but hesitant. "I don't understand. Maybe I can't yet, but I'm sorry." No long explanation, no defense. Just 3 words that meant what they meant. I leaned against the counter and read it a few times. The pain didn't vanish, but its hard edge softened. I folded the note and put it in the 3rd drawer, the one for not to decide today. Not forgiving yet, but hurting less. I poured a glass of water and looked out at the lake. The quiet was clean, like rain had washed a film of dust from the porch. I turned off the kitchen light and left a small one by the window, the old habit that says the house is awake for those who need it. But tonight I knew that light wasn't for my kids to come back and take something, it was to light the next part of my life, living without debt to anyone's expectations. I sat by the window and opened my notebook. The last line of the day flowed easily without the catch of the past weeks. Haven Ridge has gone back to the people who need it. I've gone back to myself. I closed the book and listened to the house breathe slow and deep. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a faint trace of lavender from my coat. I rested my head and knew that from here on, I didn't have to guard a gate. My work was to plant a garden again in the house, in my mind, in ordinary mornings. And that night, for the first time in months, sleep came as lightly as a letter with no conditions. A few days after Legacy Evening, the mailman knocked again. No law firm envelope, no court seal, just a cream-colored letter, corners a little curled like it had ridden in many pockets. I looked at the addressee, Loretta Mae Ellison, then turned it over. Colin. My hand paused. I pulled out a chair, poured tea, and opened it slowly so the paper wouldn't tear, as if one rough move might break whatever thin thing sat inside. "Mom, I saw the transfer files earlier through public records and a few conversations around the cafe near the foundation building. I thought you would change your mind like before. I waited for you to give in. I trusted that habit more than I trusted you. Today I understand. You have the right to do what you believe is right, even if there's no place for me in it. I'm not asking for anything. I'm only acknowledging you're right. Colin. No, I'm sorry. No, please forgive me. Just a blunt, almost awkward, acknowledgement that I have the right." I folded the letter and set it by my tea. Outside, the lake rippled lightly. I didn't cry. Maybe because my tears had turned into a different kind of quiet, a quiet with firm edges, the kind that knows the difference between genuine feeling and an attempt to steer the story. I called Renee and recited it line by line. She was silent for a moment, then said, "Tessa stopped by Haven Ridge last night. Didn't ask to go into the office, just stood outside the glass. I opened the door and she said, 'No, I just want to stand here a minute.' She talked less than usual. I think something settled. Our hearts need a solid bottom to stand on before we can say decent things," I said. We didn't dissect it further. I shifted to Joyce's new pottery class for elder caregivers, a 65-year-old woman leading it. Renee's voice warmed. "They're calling it a weekly pot-making night, not therapy. If you're free Friday, come. Bye." I laughed. "I will. I do have days now with no meetings." That afternoon I went to the Haven Ridge community room, the one I'd walked through 1,000 times with a to-do list nailed into my brain. Today I sat in the back row with no role, no title, just a woman who wanted to listen. In front, a gray-haired woman rested her hands on her knees and began. She divorced after 30 years of marriage. No sobbing, no rage, just a voice smoothed by weather. Husband gone, kids chose silence, friends thinned like fog. "I thought I'd die of loneliness," she said, "but I didn't." And one morning I realized the kitchen still had room for a wooden spoon hitting a pan, like the pan was telling me, cook anyway. If no one eats today, then eat it tomorrow. When our eyes met by chance, I nodded. She nodded back, understanding without words. In that nod, I heard a hinge open a little inside me. No fanfare, no trumpets, just accepting that breathing is an act too. The greed. Next day, I walked the lake trail. I used to rush at fast steps, eyes on the watch, counting minutes until I had to be at the office, mind sorting the to-dos. This morning I slowed, stopped by petunias still holding dew, listened to ducks call under the dock, watched the sunlight powder the water like cinnamon on a latte. I thought, maybe I grew old here, but I'm also growing young here, in the way of people no longer crushed by meeting schedules. Back home, I pulled a sticky note from the drawer, wrote with a black marker, and stuck it on the fridge. I am not an asset to be managed. I chuckled. Funny how a line in court can feel cold as steel, but on a fridge it warms up like butter melting in a pan. Maybe that's because the kitchen is where we begin again, where we feed life instead of managing it. At noon, I sat by the window and opened my journal. I wrote the chapter I'd avoided, learning to be alone without being lonely. I didn't lecture, just noted. Small footprints. Brew a pot of tea just for me, but pour it in a pretty cup like when guests are here. Play Jack's old music. Don't rush to turn it off when memory stings. Allow myself not to reply right away, even to kind messages. Replant 3 rosemary bushes, not to cook more, but to rub the leaves and remember I still have sense to live by. Walk the lake every day. No 2 laps need to be the same. I wrote until my hand tired, then leaned back. In the quiet, I notice the sadness still echoes. It passes through the living room, bounces off the glass, even slips into the drawer with Tessa's envelope, but it doesn't run the house anymore. It's a guest who now wipes its feet, sits on the edge of the chair, and leaves on time. At dusk, my phone buzzed. Renee sent a photo. Women laughing, hands covered in clay. She typed, "Joyce says every pot keeps the maker's mistake on purpose. The flaw stays to remind you this vessel came from your own hands." I snapped a picture of the fridge and sent it back, the note that says, "I am not an asset to be managed." Renee hearted it, then called, "Coming to pottery tomorrow?" "I am," I said. "I want to make a pot with my own mistake in it." That night I roasted honey, carrots, and salmon, the simplest dish I know. I plated it on china and tucked a rosemary sprig on top, like I used to when guests came. Then I served myself, ate, and cleaned up. It had been a long time since the house had someone eating dinner without needing to talk about anything important. Before bed, I slid open the 3rd drawer and reread Tessa's note. "I don't understand. Maybe I can't yet, but I'm sorry." This time, "I'm sorry," didn't prick like a needle. It touched and left a small, warm trace. I put it back, the "not today, things should stay where they are." The next morning brought light rain. I put on a coat and knit hat and walked the lake. Wet earth smelled like memories, freshly rinsed. I stood under an oak and listened to the rain on its leaves. Before, I would have used the rain to squeeze in a remote meeting, send emails, update a budget. Now I stood still. I let the rain teach me water's lesson. It falls. It soaks. It doesn't ask permission. Back home, I dried my shoes, put the kettle on, and opened Colin's letter once more. I saw what I'd missed at first. He wasn't asking for anything, and in his clumsy way, he had handed control back where it belongs, to me. A second hinge opened inside, not for anyone to walk through right away, but so the light could step in first. In the afternoon, I stopped by the community room again. The woman who divorced after 30 years spotted me and lifted her hand like you would to a familiar neighbor. We didn't speak. We shared the same room and the same quiet. When we stood, eyes met, and we nodded again. That was enough to know my body was beginning to trust this new peace. After dark, I turned on the porch light and wrote. The words didn't snag anymore. I recorded the fridge note, the walk in the rain, the decision not to call back even after a long message. I added one line to close the chapter. My victory is that I'm not afraid anymore. Not afraid of being called selfish for holding the key to my own life. Not afraid of quiet. Not afraid of seeing my own mistake in the clay pot I'll make tomorrow. Not afraid of closed doors because I know I still have plenty of windows. At Cedar Lake, wind off the water reminded me to draw the curtains. I stood and looked through the glass. My reflection faded, then returned in the kitchen light. I told myself, just like in court and on legacy night, my name is still there, clear and whole, and from tonight on, every breath in this house carries the name Loretta. Not the name of a family line, not the label of a facility, but the mark of a woman who stopped at the right time to step forward the right way. That morning, Cedar Lake was bright, the sunlight like a thin glaze over the water. I put on the cardigan Renee brought and walked the path behind the pines. Joyce's pottery studio sat in an old wooden house by the greenhouse, door painted gray-blue, big windows like a curtain drawn back. Joyce joined Havenridge a few months ago, hair silvered and tied back, voice husky warm like ginger tea. She insists on calling the class, "Make something only your hands can make," not therapy, and not a program. Because everyone has their own flaw, Joyce says. And that flaw is what makes the pot theirs. I didn't go in yet. I stood outside with my hands in my pockets and looked through a film of dust on the glass. Inside, women gathered around wheels, clay, wet and shining. Their laughs were small, the kind that touch the corners of the mouth, free laughs you can recognize without sound. One woman slipped and warped the rim. Instead of sighing, she tilted her head and chuckled, like the pot had spoken. Joyce passed behind her, didn't fix it, just touched the back of her hand and whispered something that made everyone smile. I stayed there a long while, filled with the smell of damp clay and sun dust. Something warm rose in me, but without hurry. Along the porch, I stopped at a stone bench under a maple. On its face, someone had chiseled a line, each stroke deliberate. No one gives your voice back, you take it. I traced the carving. The stone was cold, the words were cold, but the meaning was warm. I had made a long circle to understand this in my own way. In court that day, I spoke a little louder. Now, I don't need volume. I'm using that voice to set my life in order, drawer by drawer, meal by meal, breath by breath. Back home, I brewed tea and opened Colin's letter again. Not to hurt myself, and not to search for an apology that isn't there. I just wanted to see it clearly. He acknowledged my right. That's enough for today. I don't burn the sign. Letter. I fold it and slip it into the cloth-bound notebook. I labeled "Writing About Me," the notebook that doesn't record my children's stories, meetings, medical directives, or transfers. It only keeps my own small things. A still, breezy morning by the lake, the trace of lavender left on my wrist, the shadow I cast on the kitchen floor when I get up at dawn to make tea. The letter lies among those pages like a thread of a different color in the fabric, not pretty, but honest. At noon, I sit at my desk and turn on the computer. There's an old list I wrote before, things to do when I get my breath back. Today's item is anonymous support for 3 families caring for elders at home. I reach out through a small local organization and offer to cover the remaining hospital bills and night caregivers for 6 months, with one condition: don't publish my name. What if they want to know who helped? The coordinator asks. I answer, say it was someone who used to be tired. That's enough. When the transfer confirmations arrive, I exhale. I don't need a photo op. Giving is also a way to speak in my own voice. It doesn't always need a microphone. In the afternoon, I pull the old filing cabinet into the middle of the living room. Oak, heavy, every drawer packed. I spread a cloth on the rug and sit on the floor. Envelopes labeled receipts, pledges, strategy drafts, donor leads. I touch each stack, choosing like I'm choosing seeds. I keep the thank you note from a preschool teacher who brought 10 children to the Haven Ridge Garden for the first time. I keep the wobbly card from a widow. Here, I'm allowed to be silent. The rest plans that grew into something else. Handbooks that no longer fit. Call lists and meet lists I let go of. I put them in the recycling box, tie the string, set it by the door. The room feels lighter. So do I. At dinner, I set a table for one. I take a cream napkin, place a white china plate with a fine hairline crack like an old vein, and pour water into a tall glass. I lay a sprig of rosemary by the plate, not for anyone to see, but to remind myself, respect doesn't begin on a stage. It starts at a table for one. I sit, eat slowly, and listen to the sound of fork on china. It's been a long time since that sounded beautiful. After eating, I write a thank you letter to the Cedar Lake Community Trust Board. I briefly share about Legacy Evening, about people standing in silence to honor a right decision, and I write the most important line, "Thank you for upholding a no nepotism principle in admissions. Haven Ridge can forgive, but its structure is not allowed to forget." I sign, stamp it, and set it by my wallet. I'll mail it in the morning. As night comes, I go to the garden. The rosemary I replanted behind the house has taken root, its cool green scent curling up when I run my hand against the leaves. I start slow steps along the edge of the grass, counting quietly. 1, 2, 3. At 10, I change direction. No calorie goals, no turning it into a workout schedule, just walking to notice my breath. Each time my foot touches ground, I feel my chest open a fraction more. Even breathing is the reward. In the past, breath was proof I was still alive. Today, it's a small joy. Then I stop on the porch and look toward the gate. Strangely, I no longer guard it, no longer listen for tires, guess at shadows, brace my heart for impact. The gate is still there, matte black paint, hinges that whisper when the wind moves it. But now, the gate guards me not with a lock, but with peace. It's like a gentle old watchman reminding me, slow down, choose who comes in, and remember you can sit too, without waiting for anyone. Late, I call Renee. We talk about the pottery class, about Joyce, about those wobbly bowls everyone loves. Come try tomorrow? Renee nudges. I laugh. I'll come tomorrow. I want to throw a little bowl with my own flaw. Then I tell her about the line carved on the stone bench. Renee says, someone probably carved it for herself first, then for others. I think, that's exactly right. At night, I turn on the small, warm kitchen light and write. I write less, because I don't need to record everything anymore. I write just enough to remember the smells, the light, the laughter. I write about the way a middle-aged woman in class put her hands on the clay like on a stray cat, slow, patient, holding back words. I write about the wind through the pines sounding like paper rustling, about a young couple walking by hand in hand, not knowing that a few yards away a woman is learning to begin again at 69. Before bed, I open the Writing About Me notebook again. I tape in a small scrap cut from a rosemary bag, the scent still faint. Under it, I write one line, "Here, I don't prove. I live." Then I close the notebook and set it on the shelf, where the moonlight touches one corner. Past midnight, a light wind rises. I hear the roof hum, the wood flexing like skin when the weather changes. I don't jump up to check the locks anymore. I know I locked them, and more than that, I've sealed the drafts inside me. Worries don't flood in like before, they knock. I recognize them, then let them go. The gate isn't something I cling to now. It's a quiet brace that reminds me with each passing day I'm a little closer to myself. The next morning, I wake early, make a mild coffee, and sit on the steps looking at the lake under a thin veil of fog. I see an older woman pull a small cart past, pause to look into my garden, then smile and nod. I nod back. No words needed. In that small moment, I understand why Joyce insists on calling the class "Make Something Only Your Hands Can Make," because life is the same. No one can throw the pot that holds your peace for you. Others can give clay, water, and a wheel, but the touch has to be yours. In the afternoon, I pass the pottery studio. This time, I push the door open and walk in. The smell of wet clay and the faint trickle at the wash sink greet me. Joyce looks up and smiles. "Here to make your own flawed piece yet?" I answer. "Not sure where the flaw will land, but I'm here to find it." The others shift over and make room for me at a wheel. I roll up my sleeves, set the clay in the center, and press the pedal lightly. The wheel turns, the clay soft under my hands. I don't rush the shape. I just apply enough pressure, listening as my heartbeat falls into rhythm with the spin. Outside the window, the lake glints with a narrow silver streak, like a thread stitching afternoon to evening. At night, I set the table for one again, pour water into the glass, and tuck a lavender sprig in a vase. I look at the note on the fridge, "I am not an asset to be managed," and smile. Turns out, when your voice is back where it belongs, a solo, a fate meal can feel as full as a feast. Turns out, when the gate no longer needs you to guard it, it guards you with quiet. So on days you're too tired, you still remember to open a window, let the wind touch your forehead, and say something very soft. That's enough for today, Loretta. Rest. Winter arrives as gently as breath. All of Cedar Lake wears a thin veil of snow, so pristine it seems it would melt at a touch. I brew cinnamon tea, the warm, sweet scent filling the room, and sit by the fireplace listening to the soft crackle like the house's steady heartbeat. Outside the window, the lake is starting to freeze in patches. A few small birds sit on bare branches, fluffing their feathers for warmth. I realize I'm no longer in a rush. No urgent emails, no budgets to review, no meetings I once thought would make the world collapse if I missed them. On the table is the Writing About Me notebook. I open to the last page, pick up my pen, and write the line that closes the story I've been living word by word for months. I'm not waiting for anyone to grant me permission anymore. It's a simple sentence, but each stroke is a year of fear. For years, I lived like a person waiting at a threshold, waiting to be loved, to be accepted, to be nodded through so I could be myself. Now I understand. No one can sign the form that lets you live fully except you. Every Tuesday, I still stop by Havenridge, but not as founder or owner. I go as a friend of the place, bringing cookies, sometimes just to sit in the library and read a few pages, or watch the women in pottery class laugh over the turning wheels. Once, Joyce asked, "Do you feel Havenridge is different now?" I nodded. Different in that it doesn't need me, and it still lives. That made me lighter than any success report I ever got. One afternoon, I get a call from Naomi. Her voice is firm but warm. "Loretta, the civil authority has opened an investigation into Colin and Tessa's financial dealings. We don't need to go to court, just wait for the result." I sit quiet for a moment, then say, "Thank you, Naomi. As for me, I'll let the law handle it." I don't hold grudges anymore. I just hope they learn the lesson I did, that possession is never love. That night, I sit by the window and write 3 letters by hand to Tessa, Jenna, and Colin. Plain paper, my handwriting a little shaky but steady. "My children, I'm not asking for an apology, and I'm not blaming you. When you're ready to speak with respect, I'm here. Not to lecture, but to listen. I'm still your mother, but now I'm a mother who keeps her boundaries." I fold the 3 letters and seal them. I'm not sure they'll read them, but that's no longer the point. Some words need to be said so the heart has room to breathe, not to make someone answer. Night falls faster in snow season. I light a candle, put on instrumental music, and write a short passage in my notebook as if for a future reader, maybe a woman sitting in a quiet house where loneliness mingles with regret. If someone is reading this, remember, you have the right to set boundaries even with the people you love. That isn't selfish, it's how you keep your humanity from dissolving into someone else's. Real love doesn't need a deed of ownership. I set down the pen and closed the notebook. The fireplace is still glowing, the fire reflecting a warm gold on the wall like skin. Outside, snow falls so slowly it feels like time is sitting here having tea with me. I look toward the lake and see my faint reflection under the thin mist, an ordinary woman with graying hair who no longer needs permission to be herself. I smile. This story, at last, belongs to me. Not a report, not evidence, not an argument. Just the story of someone who stopped trying to be loved the right way and started loving herself the right way. I set down my teacup and let the cinnamon mingle with the scent of burning wood. Winters are always cold at Cedar Lake, but I know something inside me is warming a fire that needs no kindling, only courage. I add one last line in my journal, like a message to myself and to anyone who's lived through collapse. Don't be afraid of losing someone. Be most afraid of losing yourself while trying to keep them. Then I close the notebook, lean back, and exhale slowly. Outside, the snow keeps falling, but inside me, the sky just broke into sun. Thank you truly for staying with me to these very last lines. If you're still here, maybe somewhere in this story you recognized a part of yourself, someone who once loved with everything, was hurt, and still chose to stand up with gentleness and self-respect. I want to ask you one thing. Where are you listening from? A small kitchen glowing warm, or a quiet room with only a lamp and your heartbeat? Wherever you are, I hope you know you are not alone. If any detail impressed us, when we of action relax my dawn, my journey made you pause, remember, or feel a small ache, please share one line in the comments. Who knows, your small story might be the light someone needs to walk through their own darkness. And if you want to keep going with me with the women, mothers, and fathers who have lost but refuse to fall, please hit follow or tap like. Every comment and every heart you leave is a warm beat that helps this story travel farther and touch more souls who need a hug made of words. I'm grateful to you, from the deepest place in me, for listening, for feeling, and for staying. Because sometimes, just having one person stop with us in the long night is enough to believe we were never truly alone. The security guard looked at me, then glanced back at the photo on his computer and shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife. I smiled, thinking it was a terrible joke. 40 years of marriage, 2 children, an entire life standing behind my husband's career. And with a single sentence, I suddenly became a stranger. Before I could react, the elevator doors opened. A woman nearly 20 years younger than me stepped out, her high heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison. Every employee lowered their head to greet her, and me, the real wife, stood there, frozen. But in that very moment, I made a silent decision. I would not leave. I would stay. And I would find out the truth, no matter the cost. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Margaret Lewis Harrison. I am 60 years old, a retired high school teacher in the state of Illinois. And until that morning, I firmly believed that I was the only woman who carried the Harrison name in my husband's life. 40 years. That number is not just time. It is an entire lifetime. Mornings when I woke up early to make coffee and prepare breakfast so Richard could drive to work on time. Evenings, when I waited for him to come home late, reheated dinner, and told myself that men in leadership roles are just like that. The times I turned down career advancement to transfer schools for our children. The years I stood quietly behind him, believing that family was a shared achievement. Richard Harrison is my husband, the chief financial officer of a major real estate corporation in Chicago. He started as a young accountant and climbed step by step to a position everyone now respects. I still remember the day Richard received his first major promotion. I was standing in our small kitchen at the time, my hands trembling with happiness, thinking that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. In recent years, our marriage had lost its warmth. No more spontaneous hand-holding, no more long conversations on the couch on Friday nights. Richard came home later more often, seemed tired, sat silently in front of the television without really watching anything. I didn't suspect anything. I simply thought it was the natural result of age and responsibility. That was why, that morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a very long time: surprise my husband. I found a small invitation card in the pocket of Richard's suit jacket, printed with the company logo. A 35-year work anniversary at the firm, an internal meeting, no big celebration, no family invited. I smiled as I read it, thinking that maybe a small gesture was enough to remind him that behind all his success, there was still me. I chose a light blue floral dress that Richard once said made me look younger than my age. I tied my hair neatly and applied a soft shade of lipstick, something I rarely did after retirement. Before leaving the house, I looked at myself in the mirror and told myself that today was a good day, a normal, simple day of a wife visiting her husband. The building where Richard worked stood in downtown Chicago, its tall glass facade reflecting the pale gray sky of an autumn morning. I had been there a few times for year-end parties, but it had been a long time since I last returned. Everything looked more modern, colder than I remembered. As soon as I stepped into the lobby, I felt the security guard's gaze. He looked me up and down, not rudely, but with hesitation and scrutiny. I walked up to the reception desk and smiled as I had done for decades. "I'm here to see my husband, Richard Harrison," I said. "I'm Margaret Harrison." The receptionist looked up and typed a few lines on her computer. The smile on her face faltered, then turned into something hard to define. She glanced at the security guard. They exchanged a look so quick that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. That question made me pause. I had come here many times before. I had never needed an appointment to see my husband. "I'm his wife," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I just want to go up and say hello for a moment." The security guard stepped closer. He asked for my identification. I began to feel uneasy, but I still pulled out my wallet and handed him my driver's license. I saw his eyes scan my name, then narrow slightly. That was when he said the sentence that tore my life apart. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife." In that moment, I truly thought I had misheard him. I smiled. An automatic smile. The reflex of someone who had learned to maintain dignity. I was about to say that he must be mistaken, that my husband and I had been married for over 40 years. But before I could open my mouth, the elevator behind me opened. That woman stepped out, younger than me, in her early 40s, brown hair neatly styled, a well-fitted office dress, the confident posture of someone completely at home in this space. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at the receptionist and the security guard. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." The way they said that name, Harrison, was so light, so natural, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She nodded in response and walked on unhurriedly. No one asked for her identification. No one stopped her. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood still. It felt as if all the sound around me had disappeared, leaving only the steady click of her high heels against the marble floor, each step striking directly into my chest. I understood one thing very clearly. This was not a secret affair, not a momentary mistake. That woman had a position. She had recognition, at least in this building. My mind began replaying fragments of memory, late meetings, sudden business trips, the way Richard avoided my eyes when I asked if he was tired. Saturday nights when he said he had paperwork to finish. I had thought it was just work. Now, each small detail lined up into a cold, undeniable truth. I could have turned away. I could have left that building in humiliation. But I didn't. Maybe it was my age. Maybe 40 years of sacrifice wouldn't allow me to run away like a defeated person. Or maybe there was a part of me, very deep and very stubborn, that needed to know the truth all the way through. I turned back to the reception desk. My voice was strangely calm. "Excuse me," I said. "I have a short interview with Human Resources. I arrived a little early." The receptionist looked at me, hesitating for a few seconds. Maybe I didn't look like a troublemaker. Maybe my age made them careless. She nodded and pointed toward the elevator on the right. "8th floor," she said. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, reflecting my face in the dull metal surface. A 60-year-old woman, hair streaked with gray, eyes no longer as gentle as before. I pressed the button, feeling my heart pound so hard it seemed anyone standing beside me could hear it. As the elevator began to rise, I understood that I had willingly stepped into my own nightmare. But I also knew that from this moment on, I would no longer be the woman who closed her eyes and trusted blindly. I would be the one who asked questions, who observed, who faced the truth, no matter how cruel it might be. The elevator doors closed behind me, lifting me upward while my mind drifted far back to the years I once believed were the most solid, the safest, and also the years in which I had never once seriously asked myself, was I being betrayed? 40 years ago, Richard and I met when we were both very young. I was a college student studying education, carrying simple dreams, to become a good teacher, to have a small family, a warm home, and a life rich in meaning. Richard was different. He was ambitious, driven, always looking ahead, but it was that very difference that drew us together. I believed love could fill any gap. We married when I was 23. The wedding was small, not lavish, a simple ceremony in a local church with family and close friends present. I still clearly remember the moment Richard held my hand and whispered that he would take care of me for the rest of his life. I believed him completely, without a single doubt. At that age, I thought that as long as two people tried together, nothing was impossible. The early years of marriage were not easy. Richard started his career at a very low position. The pay was modest, the pressure high. I taught full-time, managing the household and saving every dollar. There were evenings when we sat at a small dining table, eating simple meals, talking about the future as if it were guaranteed. All we needed was a little more patience. When our children were born, life became even busier. I once had the opportunity to take a senior academic position at my school, a step many colleagues dreamed of, but it would have meant staying later, attending weekend training programs, and traveling often. Richard was at a crucial stage of his career. After many sleepless nights, I turned down the opportunity. I told myself the family needed me more, that there would be time for myself later. One refusal, then another. Gradually, I became used to stepping back, not because I was forced, but because I believed it was the right choice. Richard needed a stable support system. The children needed a mother who was always present, and I was proud that I could be that person. Richard advanced year by year. Every time he was promoted, I was the first to hear the news. I was the one standing in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine, cooking better than usual meals to celebrate. I remember the light in his eyes, the way he held me and said he couldn't have done it without me. Those words became my emotional anchor, convincing me that every sacrifice had value. Over time, a distance began to form between us. Very slowly, very quietly, so quietly that I didn't notice at first. Richard worked more. Meetings ran longer. Business trips became more frequent. At first, he still told me about his work, his colleagues, the pressures of his new role. I listened and encouraged him, as I always had. But those stories gradually became fewer. Richard came home later, ate dinner in silence, sometimes only nodded instead of answering. I asked if he was tired. He said he was fine. I asked if he needed rest. He said the work wasn't finished. I became used to not asking more. In recent years, Richard's changes became more obvious. He often came home very late. Some nights I was already asleep when he returned, and in the morning he left before I woke up. We lived under the same roof, but the time we truly spent together grew smaller and smaller. I saw his fatigue, his fading smile, the sense that he was always somewhere far away, even when sitting across from me. I once wondered whether we were slowly becoming strangers, but the thought never lasted long. I pushed it aside, convincing myself that this was normal for couples who had been together for decades. That passion couldn't last forever. That mature love was quieter and more enduring. I told myself Richard worked hard for the family, for the children, for the future. I believed his exhaustion was the price of success, and I accepted that price, as I had accepted so many things throughout this marriage. We no longer had big arguments, no more fights. Everything was smooth to the point where I once thought it was a good sign. No conflict, no drama, a stable, peaceful marriage. I called it safe. I never doubted Richard's loyalty. Not because I was naive, but because I believed some men, no matter how many temptations they face, still keep boundaries. Richard was always principled. He wasn't the type who enjoyed parties, who showed off, who flirted. At least that was how I saw him. I never checked his phone, never tracked his schedule. I respected my husband's privacy and believed that respect was the foundation of a lasting relationship. I believed that if he had something to say, he would tell me. That absolute trust became the perfect blindfold. It made me overlook the smallest signs. When Richard changed his computer password, I thought it was a company security requirement. When he took his phone into the bathroom, I thought it was a harmless habit. When he replied to late-night messages evasively, I thought it was work. I built a world for myself where everything had a reasonable explanation, where there was no place for betrayal. I believed that after 40 years, if something were wrong, I would feel it. I trusted my intuition, not knowing that intuition can be numbed by habit and long-standing trust. Standing in the rising elevator, I suddenly realized that the most painful thing was not seeing another woman called Mrs. Harrison. The most painful thing was realizing that for many years I had lived in a false sense of safety, that I had placed my entire trust in a marriage whose foundation I had never once examined. I don't blame myself for believing, Belief itself is not wrong. But I began to understand that it was precisely that unconditional trust that made today's shock so brutally cruel. If I had ever doubted, perhaps I would have been mentally prepared. If I had ever asked questions, perhaps I would not have stood frozen in that lobby. The elevator slowed. A soft chime sounded. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. 40 years of marriage that I once believed was solid was now being examined under an entirely different light, and I knew that once these doors opened, I could never return to being the woman who trusted without question. The elevator stopped with a very soft sound, as if it didn't want to startle me. The doors slid open, revealing a space completely different from the lobby below. It was quieter here, the white lighting softer, everything arranged with near-clinical neatness. This was the executive floor, where Richard had spent most of his adult life. I stepped out slowly, forcing my posture to look as natural as possible. No one noticed me right away, and that brought both relief and pain. Relief because I wasn't stopped. Pain because I realized that in this space, my existence seemed to carry no weight. I stood near the main hallway where I could see the private reception area of the executive floor. From there, I observed. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew that I needed to see, to hear, to understand. And then I saw her. Lauren. She wasn't wearing a coat, wasn't carrying a handbag like a visitor. She walked out of a small conference room holding a thin folder, her manner so familiar that no one needed to ask how long she had been there. A middle-aged man stood up to greet her, calling her name, warmly. Another woman smiled and asked if she wanted coffee. No one looked surprised by her presence. No one watched her with suspicion. She was an obvious part of this place. I stood there silently, feeling as though I were watching a play in which the lead role had been given to someone else long ago, while I was just a late-arriving audience member, never told that the story had already taken a different turn. The way they spoke to Lauren wasn't how people spoke to an ordinary colleague. There was closeness, familiarity built over years of working together. There was respect, and there was warmth. One man joked that lunch at the Italian restaurant yesterday had been wonderful. Another woman asked whether Lauren would take the kids out this weekend. The kids. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, just enough to make me take a deep breath. I didn't know whose children they were talking about. I didn't want to guess. But the pieces in my mind began to shift, quietly and terrifyingly. Then I heard that name, clearly, unmistakably. Lauren Bennett Harrison. The woman standing near the reception desk said the name as she transferred a call. Her voice was natural, as if it were a familiar name she had spoken hundreds of times. Harrison. That last name used to be mine, the name I carried for 40 years, through every stage of my life. The name I signed on my children's birth certificates, on property documents, on greeting cards sent to friends. And now it was attached to another woman, younger than me, standing just a few yards away, completely unaware that I existed. My heart tightened, not with ordinary jealousy, but with a deep sense of loss, as if a part of my identity had been taken from me and handed to someone else without my consent. I began to understand something I had been trying to avoid. Richard didn't just betray me in silence. He didn't just have a hidden relationship behind my back. He had built a parallel life, public, stable, long enough for everyone here to treat it as a given, a life in which there was no place for me. I took a few more steps, moving closer to the reception area on this floor. Immediately, a young woman looked up, her expression polite but distant. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Richard Harrison," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar even to myself. I'm his wife. The young woman looked at me, then at the screen in front of her, and typed a few lines. I saw hesitation flicker briefly in her eyes. Then she smiled, a perfectly professional smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Mr. Harrison is in a meeting, and we don't have any appointment information for you. Not, he can't see you, not, please wait, but no record of me." I repeated it more slowly, as if clarity might change something. "I'm his wife." The young woman tilted her head slightly, a trace of confusion crossing her face, then turned to a man standing nearby, probably an assistant. They exchanged a look. I saw them speak quietly, but I didn't need to hear the words. I wasn't in the system. I didn't belong here. The man stepped forward, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, at this time we can't allow you into Mr. Harrison's private work area without prior confirmation." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, because in that moment I realized how fragile my position was. If I reacted emotionally, if I caused a scene, I would become an older woman making trouble, an inconvenience to be handled quickly. And I wasn't here to be escorted out. That feeling of rejection was unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, cold, like a door closing that you never realized had been open. I felt as if I had been erased from a part of a life I once believed was mine. I looked around again. Everyone continued with their work. Lauren walked past talking to someone, smiling lightly. No one looked at me. No one realized that the woman standing against the wall was Richard Harrison's legal wife. In that moment, a powerful urge rose inside me to step forward, to call Richard's name loudly, to ask them who they thought I was. But I didn't do it. I had lived long enough to know that impulsive reactions rarely bring the truth. They only bring chaos. I chose silence. Silence not because I was weak, but because I needed to observe. I needed to remember every detail, every look, every word. I needed to understand how this picture had been drawn and for how long. In my mind, there was only one thought, so clear it didn't need to be spoken. I needed evidence, not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone, but to protect myself, so that when I faced Richard, and I knew that day was coming very soon, I wouldn't have only emotions, but facts. I stood there a few more minutes, long enough to be certain this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained with a simple apology. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the conference rooms. My heart beat slower than before, but heavier. Each step carried a new realization. The marriage I once believed was solid had been built on spaces I was never invited into. And I understood that from this moment on, I was no longer a woman living in blind trust. I was someone standing in a place that didn't belong to her, quietly gathering the pieces of a truth that had been hidden for many years. I stood still for a few more seconds, long enough for my heartbeat to slow. No one noticed me. In this place, the silence of an older woman didn't spark curiosity or concern. I realized that was both cruel and my only advantage right now. I continued down the hallway leading into the executive meeting area. When the receptionist on this floor looked up again, I lowered my head slightly and smiled, keeping my voice low and steady. I arrived early for a short discussion with human resources, I said, avoiding direct eye contact. They told me I could wait in this area. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe I looked more like a retired teacher than a troublemaker. Maybe no one imagined that a woman my age would have any reason to cause problems on the executive floor. I walked past without being stopped. The hallway was long and quiet, covered in dark gray carpet, evenly lit with no windows. Conference rooms line both sides, their frosted glass doors revealing long tables, black leather chairs, ceiling-mounted projectors. The faint smell of coffee hung in the air, so familiar it hurt. Richard used to tell me that the smell of coffee at the office helped him stay alert. I had made coffee for him every morning, for decades. I slowed my steps when I heard voices ahead, not Richard's, but voices I guessed had known him for a long time. I stopped at the corner of the hallway, leaning close to the wall, a habit formed during my years as a teacher. Listen before entering an unfamiliar space. "Is Mr. Harrison having lunch with Lauren today?" a man asked casually. "Of course," a female voice replied with a hint of teasing. "Every Thursday. Their usual restaurant." There. The word was soft, but it landed like a weight on my chest. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand unconsciously tightening around my purse strap. I couldn't see them, only hear their voices. Natural, unguarded. "I heard Lauren made the reservation earlier today," the man continued. "Sounds like they want to discuss something important." "Probably the new project," the woman replied. "Lauren always arranges everything so carefully for Mr. Harrison." I closed my eyes for a brief second. Lauren. That name was no longer distant. It echoed here with a familiarity I had never had, not whispered as a secret, not avoided, but part of the daily rhythm of this place. I stood there listening, each sentence like a slow, precise cut. They talked about lunch, about restaurants, about routines, small details that only long-term relationships have. No one lowered their voice. No one sounded cautious. Then the conference room door ahead opened. I didn't have time to step farther back. I stood still, half hidden by the wall. Richard walked out with two other men. He looked exactly as he always did. Dark suit, quick stride, the familiar face I had looked at for 40 years. In that moment, my heart tightened in a completely different way. Not panic, not trembling, but a terrifying stillness. "I have lunch with Lauren today," Richard said calmly, as if confirming a meeting. "We'll continue this later." From his own mouth. No hesitation, no cover-up, no doubt. My world didn't collapse loudly like in the movies. It didn't explode. It froze. Everything around me became sharply clear. The lights, the footsteps, the rustle of papers. And I became empty. A cold sensation spread from my chest to my stomach, then through my limbs. I stopped shaking. I didn't want to cry. I just stood there as if part of me had stepped outside myself to observe everything from a distance. All doubt ended in that moment. No more maybe, no more what if, no more I'm overthinking. The truth stood right in front of me, so clear it didn't need any further proof. Richard didn't just betray me. He had lived another life, openly, in plain sight, among people I had never been introduced to. I watched him turn and walk toward his private office. None of the others noticed me. I was just a faint figure in a long hallway, someone who didn't belong here. And strangely enough, that helped me stay calm. I understood that if I kept standing there, hiding, I would always be an eavesdropper, always an outsider. I had seen enough. Enough to know I couldn't go home and pretend I hadn't heard anything. Enough to understand that if I didn't confront this now, I might never get another chance. I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice from shaking. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder, smoothed the skirt of my dress, a familiar reflex from years before stepping into a classroom. I was no longer a teacher standing before students, but I was still a woman who had lived long enough to know there are moments you cannot avoid. I stepped out from the shadows and walked straight toward Richard's office door. The door was slightly open. I saw his back as he placed a folder on the desk. His office was spacious, orderly, exactly his style. On the bookshelf were the economics books he used to read in the evenings. On the desk was a framed family photo, taken 10 years earlier before the children married. I had dusted that frame countless times. I knocked. Not loud, not soft, just enough for him to hear. "Come in," Richard said without turning around. I opened the door and stepped inside. The moment he turned and his eyes met mine, I knew I didn't need to say much anymore. Every explanation, every excuse, every denial became meaningless in that instant. His face changed quickly, from surprise to shock, then to panic, a reaction I had seen many times before when students were caught cheating on a test. "Margaret?" he blurted out, his voice rough. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, looking at the man I had called my husband for 40 years, not to find familiarity, but to confirm that I was seeing him with my own eyes, without the filter of trust. The panic in his eyes was the clearest answer. In that moment, I understood I had crossed a line I could never step back over. I was no longer the woman standing in the hallway listening to fragmented conversations. I had walked straight into the center of the truth, and whatever happened next, I knew that from this point on, I would no longer be passive. I remained standing in front of Richard's desk, not taking another step forward, not out of fear, but because I needed that distance to avoid doing something I might regret. The room was so quiet I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner, even the uneven breathing of the man in front of me. Richard stood up from his chair, then sat back down as if he didn't know what to do with his body. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture whenever he was unsettled. I had seen it countless times over 40 years whenever he faced a difficult decision. The difference now was that I was the one trapped without an escape. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I can explain." I nodded slightly, like a teacher allowing a student to begin an answer. I didn't sit down. I didn't lean on anything. I wanted to stay alert. "Go ahead," I said. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "I'm listening." Richard swallowed hard. He glanced toward the door as if considering whether someone might overhear, then looked back at me. In that moment, I saw how much he had aged, not from years, but from the cracking of the solid shell I had once trusted. "I met Lauren 15 years ago," he began slowly. Each word dragged from his chest. "During a long business trip in California. At the time, I wasn't looking for anything. It just happened." I didn't react. I didn't ask why. I just looked at him and let him continue. "She worked with one of our partner teams," he said. "Smart, calm. At first, it was just lunches, work discussions. I knew it was wrong, but I thought I could control it." I listened as if hearing a cold report. No extra details, no emotion, just a sequence of events arranged to sound reasonable. "Then it went beyond control," he continued, his voice dropping. I tried to stop. I really did. My hand tightened around my purse strap. In my mind, I saw the evenings I sat alone in the kitchen, waiting for him to come home late, telling myself his work was always demanding. "Lauren got pregnant," Richard said. The sentence fell between us without echo or sound, but I felt a heavy force press down on my chest. I didn't step back. I didn't cover my mouth. I just stood there, receiving it as a final truth that could not be undone. "I panicked," he continued. "I thought about telling you many times, but every time I looked at you, looked at the kids, I didn't know where to begin. I tilted my head slightly. "So you chose not to tell me," I said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded slowly. "I thought, if I kept everything stable, if I didn't let it affect the family, then maybe that was the least harmful way." I gave a small laugh, not a happy one, but a very brief, quiet sound, like the reflex of someone who has just heard something too absurd to be real. "You thought silence was a way to protect me?" I asked. "Or a way to protect yourself?" Richard lowered his head. Didn't answer right away. His silence said more than any explanation could. "You lived 2 lives," I said, each word clear. "One with me, one with her. And you call that stability." "I'm sorry," Richard said quickly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was afraid of losing you." I looked at him for a long time. Maybe for the first time in years, I wasn't looking at him as a wife, but as someone assessing the truth in front of her. "You were afraid of losing me," I repeated. "But you weren't afraid of losing honesty. You weren't afraid of losing trust. You weren't afraid of letting me live in a lie for 15 years. Richard reached out his hand, then stopped halfway, as if remembering that he no longer had the right to touch me. "I arranged everything," he said. "I thought I could manage it. Work, family, responsibilities. I never neglected you or the kids." I took a deep breath. "Do you know that every time you said, 'I'll be home late tonight,' it was a lie?" I asked. "Every time you said you had an unexpected business trip? Every time you walked into the house looking exhausted and silent?" Richard didn't respond. I knew he understood. I suddenly realized that for 15 years, I had been living inside a script that was already written, one where I always played the trusting wife, and he played the hard-working family man. Every detail I had accepted without question now stood out clearly, sharply, impossible to deny. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't slam my hand on the desk. Maybe because my tears had already run dry the moment I heard Lauren's name spoken in the hallway. Or maybe because, in this moment, I no longer had the energy to be angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a very long road to arrive at a place I could never return from. "I didn't come here to argue," I said, "and I didn't come here to listen to your justifications." Richard looked up, his eyes full of confusion. "Then, why did you come?" I looked around his office, the room where he had built his power, his reputation, and another part of his life. I thought of the family photo on his desk, the picture that now suddenly felt out of place. "I came to know the truth," I said, "and now I do." I turned and walked toward the door. Richard called my name, his voice breaking. "Margaret, please, we can talk more. I'll explain everything. We can figure something out." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. "No," I said very softly but firmly. "There is no we here anymore." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. No one paid attention to me. The men and women outside continued with their work, their everyday conversations. The world didn't stop just because my marriage had collapsed. I walked straight to the elevator and pressed the button. When the doors closed, I finally allowed myself to let out a long breath. I didn't cry. I just felt empty. As the elevator went down, I looked at my reflection in the dim mirror. A 60-year-old woman standing straight, her eyes no longer unfocused. I knew very clearly that what I had left behind wasn't just Richard's office, but a marriage that had been dead for a long time. Only today, I had officially laid it to rest. And I also knew that when I stepped out of that building, I would never return in my old role again. I walked out of the building when the sun was higher than when I arrived, but the light didn't make me feel any warmer. The wind swept across the plaza in front of the entrance, carrying early fallen yellow leaves that brushed lightly against my feet before drifting away. Everything continued as usual. Cars, pedestrians, distant horns. Only I felt as if I had been pulled out of a familiar orbit. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. I needed that quiet, like a fragile buffer between what I had just learned and what I was about to face. The road home was so familiar I could drive it without looking at the signs. I had taken this route for decades, driving the kids to school, going grocery shopping, coming home after teaching. Today, it felt longer than usual. The house came into view, the house I had once called home. The white painted front, the maple trees in the yard that had grown tall over the years, their branches nearly covering the living room windows. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, my hands still on the steering wheel. Not because I wasn't ready to go inside, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, the feeling of standing in front of something familiar, knowing I was about to see it with different eyes. Inside, everything was the same. There was no sign that life here had ever been shared with another woman. Richard's coat still hung on the hook by the door. The shoes he wore most often were neatly placed under the shelf. The familiar scent of wood and mild cleaner still lingered in the air. If not for this morning, I would have thought everything was intact. I set my purse down on the table, took off my coat, and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure where to begin. I wasn't looking for an emotional outburst. I was looking for the truth. And I knew that if Richard had managed to hide another life from me for 15 years, there had to be traces. I went upstairs and entered our bedroom. That room had once been the place where I felt safest. Now it was simply a space that needed to be examined. I opened Richard's closet. Everything was arranged as neatly as ever, suits hanging by color, shirts folded carefully, ties rolled in a drawer. Nothing looked unusual on the surface. I began searching through the drawers, calmly, without panic. I had taught long enough to know that the truth rarely sits in obvious places. I checked the pockets of old suit jackets, the lower drawers where Richard kept, things he rarely used. Then I saw it, a small, dark wooden box tucked deep inside, hidden behind thick winter socks. The box wasn't large, but it felt heavier than I expected when I picked it up. It had a small lock. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. Richard had never mentioned it. I tried to open it, but it was locked. In that moment, I didn't hesitate. I opened the vanity drawer, took out the small scissors I used to cut loose threads, and gently pried at the lock. There was a dry click. The lid popped open. Inside were neatly arranged documents, as if someone had carefully organized their secret life. I took them out one by one and laid them on the bed. A lease agreement for an apartment on the other side of the city in Richard's name. The lease had started 15 years ago and had been renewed regularly. I recognized the area, not far from where his company once had a branch office. Next were bank statements, an account I had never known about, regular transfers, consistent, stretching over many years. Not impulsive spending from a temporary affair, but planned, responsible financial support. I didn't need to be an accountant to understand that. Then there were photographs. I picked up the first one, my heart sinking. Richard stood beside Lauren, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They were at a beach, sunlight bright around them. His smile, the smile I hadn't seen in years. The next photo showed Richard holding a small child, then the child growing older in each frame. Birthdays, parks, dinner tables, a complete family recorded over time. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the photos spread out in front of me. There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to explain away. This wasn't a mistake. This was another life built alongside mine. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because every tear seemed frozen. I just sat there, looking at the undeniable evidence, letting the truth sink in. 15 years. While I lived with a husband I trusted completely, he had been a father to another child, a partner to another woman. I don't know how long I sat there. When I finally stood up, the light outside the window had shifted toward afternoon. I gathered the documents and placed them back into the wooden box, leaving it unlocked. There was no need anymore. I heard a car pull up outside. A car door closing. Richard was home. My heartbeat slowed. Steadier now. I realized I was ready for this moment, even though I hadn't planned it. Richard walked into the house and called my name as usual. His voice echoed from downstairs, carrying the familiar tiredness. I picked up the wooden box and walked down the stairs. When he saw me standing there with the box in my hands, his eyes darkened. He understood immediately. No explanation was needed. "Margaret," he began. I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. "You don't need to say anything else," I said. My voice was steady. "I've seen enough." Richard stood still. His shoulders slumped, as if he finally no longer had the strength to hold himself upright. He looked at the box, then at me. I no longer saw the powerful man from earlier that day, just someone stripped of every disguise. "I want you to leave this house," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "Tonight." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He took a deep breath, then shook his head. "Margaret, we can talk. I'll explain. No," I interrupted. Not loudly, but firmly. "There's nothing left to explain. You had 15 years to talk. I don't owe you another minute." He looked around the house, as if only now realizing it was about to no longer be his. "This is my home," he said weakly. "No," I replied. "This was our home once. But you chose to live somewhere else a long time ago." Silence stretched between us. Finally, Richard nodded very slightly. He turned and went upstairs to pack. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to drawers open, clothes being pulled out. Each sound felt like a final period. When he came back down with a small suitcase, I opened the door for him. No tears, no pleading. Just a clear ending that couldn't be reversed. The door closed behind Richard. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. Then I turned back inside, closed the door, and locked it. For the first time in my life, I didn't compromise. I didn't convince myself to accept what was unacceptable. I didn't stay in a marriage that had been dead for a long time. I stood in the quiet house, took a deep breath, and knew that whatever lay ahead, I had just done the only thing left for me to do: choose myself. The next morning, I woke up very early, even though I had barely slept. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. No familiar footsteps in the kitchen, no refrigerator door opening, no soft cough I had heard for decades. I got up, put on my robe, and walked through the house, as if to confirm that I was truly alone now. The first thing I did was call a locksmith to change all the locks, not out of hatred, but because I needed a clear boundary. When the locksmith asked if I was sure, I nodded without hesitation. The old keys were removed, placed into his toolbox, and disappeared from my life in a very ordinary way. I realized that sometimes the biggest changes happen quietly. After that, I called a lawyer a friend had recommended years ago, someone I never thought I would need. The woman on the other end of the line was calm and professional. I didn't go into details. I simply said I needed advice about a divorce after many years of marriage, involving assets and long-term infidelity. She didn't sound surprised. She just scheduled a meeting later that week. When I hung up, I sat still for a moment, realizing I had taken another step away from my old life. But the hardest part was still ahead. I called my 2 children, one by one. I asked them to come over that evening, saying I had something important to talk about in person. My voice sounded normal, even to me. Maybe because if I had let the emotions surface then, I wouldn't have been able to finish the sentence. Both of them sensed something was wrong, but neither pressed for details. The afternoon passed slowly. I tidied the living room and brewed a pot of tea, as if preparing for an ordinary conversation, but nothing about that day was ordinary. When the doorbell rang, my heart tightened. My son came in first, followed by my daughter. Both looked around the house, then at me, their faces full of concern. "What's going on, Mom?" my daughter asked, gripping my hand tightly. I motioned for them to sit down. I sat across from them, my hands resting on my knees. I took a deep breath. I had stood in front of classrooms for decades, spoken about difficult topics with students, but I had never felt that telling the truth could be so heavy. "Your father doesn't live here anymore," I began. Both of them froze. My son frowned. "Did Dad go on a business trip?" I shook my head slowly. "No, your father has been living another life for 15 years. The air in the room thickened. I saw my daughter's eyes widen, as if she didn't understand what I had just said. My son sat up straight, his voice tense. "What are you saying?" I didn't go around it. I told them, without embellishment, without excuses. I spoke about the other woman, about 15 years of lies, about a child born from that relationship. I didn't give unnecessary details. I only said what needed to be said, what they had the right to know. When I finished, the room fell silent. My daughter lowered her head, tears falling onto her sleeve. My son stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his hands clenched. "That's impossible," he said. "Dad wouldn't do that." I stood up and placed my hand on his shoulder. "I used to think so too," I said softly. That moment hurt more than anything Richard had done to me. Watching my children, who had trusted their father completely, now forced to face this truth, felt like my heart was being torn apart. His betrayal of me was one thing, but the collapse I saw in my children's eyes, that was what nearly took my breath away. Does that mean we have a sister?" my daughter asked, her voice shaking. I nodded. "Yes." The answer left them both silent, not out of jealousy, but because too many emotions collided at once. Shock, confusion, pain, and a sense of loss they couldn't yet name. "She's not at fault," I said immediately, before anything else could be said. "No matter how hard this is to accept, that child is completely innocent. She didn't choose the circumstances she was born into." My son stopped pacing and looked at me. There was an anger in his eyes I had never seen before. "Dad did this to you," he said. "He did this to our family." I nodded. "I know, but I won't turn this into a campaign to destroy him. I don't need to tear your father down to prove anything. The truth is heavy enough on its own." I looked at each of them. "Your father was wrong. Very wrong. But I don't want you to carry hatred for the rest of your lives. You have the right to be angry, the right to be disappointed. But I hope you remember that how you face this also says something about who you are." My daughter broke down, leaning into my shoulder. I held her, feeling her body tremble. My son stood there, eyes red, struggling to hold himself together. I knew each of them was reacting in their own way. There was no right or wrong response in that moment. "My family," my daughter choked up. "Are we still a family, Mom?" I stroked her hair, my voice slow but steady. "Our family has been hurt, but we haven't lost our dignity. I haven't lost myself, and neither have you." I looked around the room, the place that once held laughter, dinners, and conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. "A family isn't defined only by a marriage," I said. "It's defined by how the people in it treat one another when everything falls apart." We sat together for a long time that night. There were questions I couldn't answer. There were emotions I could only listen to. I didn't force my children to forgive. I didn't ask them to take sides. I only said that I had made a decision for my own life and I would take responsibility for it. When my children left, the house fell silent again. But this time, I didn't feel as empty as I had the night before. I was exhausted, but it was a meaningful kind of exhaustion. I knew I had just been through one of the hardest conversations of my life, and I hadn't avoided it. I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom and looked at the woman reflected there. No longer a wife standing behind a successful man. No longer someone who constantly compromised to keep the peace. I saw a woman standing upright, even though her shoulders were still heavy. My family had fallen apart in a way I never imagined, but I wasn't broken. I hadn't lost my self-respect, and in that moment I understood that from this day on, I would no longer live as Richard's wife. I began to stand up, not with anger, but with the clarity of a woman who had finally chosen to step out of someone else's shadow and walk on her own feet. 3 days after the night I told my children the truth, when the house had finally returned to the slow rhythm of someone living alone, my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, as if my body already knew who was on the other end. "Margaret?" A woman's voice said, low and hesitant. "This is Lauren." I didn't answer right away. I sat down in the armchair near the window, where the afternoon sunlight usually slanted through the curtains. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a long road without stopping to rest. "I know," I said after a few seconds. My voice was calm, not trembling at all. "Richard told me that you know everything now," Lauren continued. "I'm not calling to apologize on his behalf. I thought we should meet, if you think that's possible." I was silent. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. I didn't owe that woman any explanation. But another part of me, the part that no longer ran away, understood that some meetings aren't for reconciliation, but for closure. "All right," I said, "once." We agreed to meet at a small cafe far from both my neighborhood and Richard's office area. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to wait, but to choose a seat that made me feel safe. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the door, a new habit I couldn't remember learning. Lauren walked in right on time. I recognized her immediately, even though she was dressed far more simply than the day I saw her at the office. No high heels, no fitted dress, just a neutral coat, dark jeans, her hair neatly tied back. She looked around, then spotted me. Her eyes paused for a brief moment before she walked over to the table. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down across from me. I nodded. "Let's be direct," I replied. "I don't have much I want to hear." Lauren took a deep breath. "I understand." Neither of us ordered a drink right away. The air between us was tight, like a rope pulled too far, but there was no loud hostility. Just two women sitting across from each other, forced to truly see one another for the first time. I knew about you from the beginning, Lauren said. She didn't avoid it. Richard never said he was single. That didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what I had already guessed. I nodded slightly. And yet you stayed, I said. Yes, Lauren answered. I told myself I wasn't the one breaking your family, that your marriage already had problems. I looked at her, neither smiling nor arguing right away. You're very good at comforting yourself, I said. Not sarcastically, just honestly. Lauren lowered her head. Maybe I am. I'm not proud of it. She told her story, not long-winded, no tears. She said she had never been a legal wife, never had the Harrison last name on any documents, never appeared openly at family events. She existed in a vague in-between, not a secret affair, but not a real wife either. I lived like a wife without a name, she said, in a rented apartment, at dinners without relatives, on holidays with just the three of us. 3 people. Richard, her, and the child. I used to believe I accepted that for my daughter, Lauren continued, that I was sacrificing for her. But as time went on, I wasn't so sure anymore. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not through the eyes of a betrayed wife, but through the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to see that lies rarely have only one victim. Do you know how I lived? I asked. No anger, no accusation, just a question. Lauren shook her head. I only knew you were there, like something taken for granted, like a shadow I tried not to look at directly. I exhaled softly. I lived as a trusting wife, I said, believing that silence meant peace, believing exhaustion was the price of success, believing that if I didn't ask questions, everything would be fine. We sat in silence for a moment. The server came by to ask for our order. I asked for hot tea. Lauren ordered black coffee. When the server left, I continued. I didn't come here to forgive, I said, and I don't think you need that from me. Lauren nodded. I didn't expect it. I just need to understand, I said, so I don't carry hatred with me. Lauren looked at me, her expression softening for the first time. If there's one thing I want you to know, she said, it's that I never thought I won. I looked at her slowly. I know. Because no one wins in a life built on division. Not the legal wife, not the woman on the sidelines, not the child born into silence. The only person who benefited for a very long time was Richard. I don't blame you, I said. Not because you were right, but because I don't want to keep focusing on the wrong place. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding. Thank you for that, she said quietly. I stood up. I think we've said enough. Lauren stood as well. Margaret, she called, as I had already turned away. I stopped, but didn't turn around. Do you love him? I asked, surprising even myself. Lauren was silent for a long time. I don't know, she finally said. I think I loved the role I was given, and when that role disappeared, I'm not sure what I have left. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. I understand, I said. I walked out of the cafe and took a deep breath of the cool air outside. The feeling in my chest wasn't as heavy anymore, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer carried a distorted image of the other woman. She wasn't my enemy. She was part of the lie and had been hurt by it in her own way. The misplaced focus had never been on the 2 women standing on opposite ends of the story. It was on the man who chose silence for 15 years and called it protection. As I drove home, I realized my hands were no longer shaking. There was no tightness in my throat. I didn't forgive, but I didn't carry hatred either. And for me, at this stage of life, that already felt like a form of freedom. After that, time moved at a different pace, slower but clearer. No more days of waiting and uncertainty. No more guessing what time Richard would come home, whether he was tired, whether he was busy. My life no longer revolved around someone else, and at first that left me more confused than relieved. The divorce process moved faster than I expected, perhaps because Richard didn't resist. He signed every document quietly, exhausted. The assets were divided fairly, according to the law and according to what I deserved after 40 years together. The house remained mine. Part of his retirement was reallocated. There were no loud arguments, no painful tug of war. Everything ended in a cold, almost administrative way. And perhaps that was the most fitting end for a marriage that had been dead for a long time. The day I held the divorce decree in my hands, I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious either. I only felt a door closing behind me, softly but decisively. I stood outside the lawyer's building, watching people pass by, and for the first time in many years, I had no one to call, no one to share that moment with. And strangely, I didn't feel as empty as I had feared. In the days that followed, I began doing very small things, but for myself. I cleared out the room that had once been Richard's office. I took down the plaques, the old documents, the books he had left behind, not in anger, but with clarity. I repainted the walls a lighter color and placed a small wooden desk near the window. I bought a few green plants. The room gradually became something else, no longer marked by a powerful man, but by a woman learning how to live again. I found my old notebooks, yellowed pages where I had once written, scattered thoughts back when I was teaching. I started writing again. Not to tell Richard's story, but to listen to my own voice. I wrote about quiet mornings, about sunlight falling across the wooden floor, about the feeling of making tea for someone, myself, without needing to ask what they preferred. Some afternoons, I sat in the living room for a long time without turning on the television or playing music, just sitting there, listening to the ticking of the clock. At first, the silence made me uncomfortable. I had grown used to always having someone nearby, even if it was just a quiet presence. But slowly, I realized silence wasn't an enemy. It was simply a space that had never been filled with my own voice. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. Some evenings I ate a simple meal and washed the dishes right away, not leaving them for the next day. Some mornings I woke up later than usual, brewed coffee, and read the newspaper slowly. I didn't have to report my schedule to anyone. I didn't have to adjust my habits to suit someone else. Those small things, which I had never thought about before, now brought me a strange sense of freedom. I called old friends, people I had been telling someday when I have time for years, without ever having time. We met at small restaurants and talked about things unrelated to family or responsibility. Some knew my story, some didn't. I no longer felt the need to explain my life to everyone. I only needed to be present as I was. One friend invited me to join an evening painting class. I almost refused out of habit, then stopped myself. I remembered that I used to enjoy painting a long time ago. So I went. I sat in a room filled with the scent of oil paint, holding a brush that felt unfamiliar, and let the colors spread freely across the paper. No one judged. No one compared. I didn't need to be good. I just needed to try. Solo trips came afterward naturally. At first, it was just a short drive to a coastal town I'd always wanted to visit, but kept postponing because it was inconvenient. I booked a small room, brought a book, and walked along the shore early in the morning. There was no one beside me, no one to talk to, but I didn't feel empty. I felt more observant of the waves, the birds, the strangers who were also walking alone. On those trips, I began to look back on my life through a different lens. I wasn't only a betrayed wife. I had been a dedicated teacher, a mother, a friend, and now I was an independent woman stepping into a new stage of life, even if that stage arrived later than I once imagined. There were still moments when sadness visited unexpectedly, like a cold gust of wind, seeing an elderly couple holding hands on the street, hearing an old song. Memories don't disappear just because you sign divorce papers, but they no longer controlled me. I allowed myself to remember, then allowed myself to move on. I realized I was slowly reclaiming my sense of self, not through dramatic changes, but through small, steady choices. I chose to wear the dress I liked without asking anyone's opinion. I chose to eat what I wanted. I chose to spend time on things that made me feel alive. Those choices, added together day after day, formed a person I thought I had lost. I no longer defined myself through marriage. I no longer introduced myself as someone's wife. When people asked if I was retired, I simply smiled and said I was enjoying a new chapter of life. No further explanation needed. One morning, I woke up and realized I was looking forward to the day, not because I had an appointment, not because I had something to do, but because I was curious how I would feel. That realization made me sit quietly on the bed for a long time, my hand resting on my chest, as if to make sure it was real. I wasn't younger. I hadn't forgotten the pain, but I was being reborn in the way of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that life isn't just about existing, but about being fully yourself, without a role to play. And for the first time in many years, that's how I felt I was living. I met Samuel Brooks on a very ordinary afternoon, in a way that, if someone had told me about it years earlier, I would have smiled politely and forgotten it. There was no fateful moment, no lightning strike glance, no racing heartbeat like in the stories people like to tell. Just a quiet afternoon, and two people who had endured enough loss to no longer rush. That day, I went to the public library near my home to return a few books. It was early fall, the sunlight gentle, the air cool and fresh. I stopped at the magazine rack, flipping through a travel magazine about Europe that I was considering for an upcoming trip. As I put the magazine back, a man's voice spoke behind me, neither too close nor too far. "You like small towns? In the south of France, too?" I turned around. The man standing there was of average height, his gray hair neatly kept, wearing an old but clean jacket, his eyes calm and kind. Not the type trying to impress, no rushed, polite smile, just someone genuinely curious. "I've never been," I replied, "but I like the idea of places that aren't noisy." He nodded as if my answer confirmed something he had already guessed. "I went once, many years ago, when my wife was still alive." He said it naturally, without sadness, without avoidance. I immediately recognized someone who had lived with loss long enough not to hide it. We talked for a few more minutes, about books, about traveling without packed schedules, about living alone after children grow up. When we parted, he introduced himself as Samuel Brooks. I simply nodded and smiled, not thinking that the brief conversation would continue. But a week later, I saw him again at the same library. This time, we sat at a table near the window, each reading a different book, occasionally exchanging a few scattered remarks. No one asked for a phone number. No one suggested meeting again. Just the presence of two people who didn't feel uncomfortable sharing silence together. Everything unfolded so slowly, it was almost unnoticeable. A coffee afterward, then another walk in the park. Samuel always walked half a step slower than I did, as if unconsciously adjusting his pace to match mine. He never asked intrusive questions. He wasn't overly curious about my past. When I spoke, he listened. When I was silent, he didn't try to fill the space. No promises were made. No lines like, "We will be this," or "our future." And strangely, that was exactly what made me feel safe. I had lived with too many empty promises, words used to postpone the truth. With Samuel, there were no expectations placed on my shoulders. We met only when we both wanted to. Some weeks we didn't see each other at all. Some days we exchanged just a short message. "The weather is nice today." No one complained. No one checked up on the other. No one demanded anything. What made me realize the biggest difference wasn't in gestures, but in how I was listened to. When I spoke, Samuel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to give advice. He didn't compare my story to anyone else's. He listened as if what I said truly mattered, not as something to endure until it was his turn to speak. Once, when I was talking about the years I had lived in silence in my former marriage, I stopped halfway, afraid I was saying too much. Samuel looked at me and said very softly, "You don't have to summarize your life for me. I have time." That sentence made me turn my face away for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because I realized how long it had been since anyone had told me they had time for me, not out of obligation, but by choice. I told my children about Samuel after a few months, not to ask permission, but because I didn't want to hide anything. My daughter listened carefully, then smiled. "You look different, Mom," she said, "not because there's someone new, but because you feel lighter." My son asked a few more practical questions, as was his nature. What Samuel did, where he lived, whether he was serious. I answered honestly. I didn't know, and I didn't need to know right now. What reassured me was that neither of them objected. They could see that I wasn't losing myself in this relationship. I still lived in my own house. I still had my own routine. I still traveled alone. Samuel was part of my life, not the center of it. Once he asked if I'd like to go with him to a small concert in a nearby town. I agreed. We sat next to each other in the small hall, soft lights, music flowing slowly. Samuel didn't hold my hand. He simply rested his hand on the armrest, close enough for me to know he was there. I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was continuing, but as a different version of myself, a version that didn't need to sacrifice herself to keep the peace, didn't need to stay silent to avoid conflict, didn't need to play the role of the understanding woman by accepting everything. Samuel didn't make promises. He didn't talk about a distant future, but he was always there at the right moments. When I caught a cold, he brought over a bag of hot soup and left it at the door, not coming inside unless I invited him. When I traveled, he wished me a good trip and didn't ask who I was going with. When I came back, he listened to my stories without impatience. Happiness came to me very gently. It didn't overwhelm me. It didn't make me lose my guard. It was simply a sense of peace, knowing I could share space and time with someone without having to make myself smaller. One morning, I brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the sunlight rise. I realized I was smiling for no particular reason. I didn't need to name happiness. I just needed to live in it, slowly, clearly, and fully, in the way of a woman who had learned that love isn't a trade-off, but coexistence. I received a call from my son early one morning, when the house was still wrapped in a thin layer of quiet. His voice on the other end sounded deeper than usual, with a hint of hesitation before he got straight to the point. "Mom, Dad's been hospitalized." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was shocked, but because I needed to identify my own feelings. The news didn't panic me. It passed through like a cold breeze, enough to remind me that some threads, even when cut, still leave marks. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice even. "His heart," my son replied. "Not critical, but not minor either. The doctors want to monitor him." I looked out the window where the early sunlight was filtering through the curtains. Samuel had left early, leaving a short note on the kitchen table. "I have a routine checkup today. I'll stop by tonight if you want." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. I knew I would have to make a decision, not out of duty, but out of clarity. "I'll come by tonight," I said to my son, "not to stay, just to visit." Hospitals always have a particular smell, the scent of disinfectant, of waiting, of time stretched thin. I walked into the lobby and followed the signs to the cardiology ward. Every step was steady. I wasn't going as a wife. I was going as someone who had once shared a long chapter of life with the person lying in that room. When I arrived, both of my children were already there. My daughter stood up first and hugged me lightly. My son nodded, his fatigue clearly visible. I spoke with the doctor, listened to the necessary information. Stable condition, needs rest, needs time. Familiar, neutral words carrying no emotion. Then the hospital room door opened. Lauren was standing there. She looked different from the last time I saw her. Thinner, dark circles under her eyes, her hair hastily tied back. Beside her stood a teenage girl, reserved, her hands clasped together. I recognized her immediately. No introduction needed. The child had Richard's eyes. The space between us froze. Two families, two lives that had once run parallel, now collided in a narrow hallway. There were no polite greetings, no challenging looks, just the heavy awkwardness of people placed in a situation no one had wished for. My daughter stepped forward naturally. "I'm Anna," she said to the girl. "If you want, we can sit together." The girl looked up at Lauren, then at Anna, and nodded very slightly. That moment tightened my chest, not with pain, but because I saw something adults often forget. Children don't carry adults' histories. They only carry their own confusion. I looked at Lauren. She looked back at me, her eyes no longer guarded, only tired. We didn't speak. There was no need. When it was my turn to go into the room, I went in alone. Richard lay on the bed, looking smaller than I remembered, not because illness had weakened him too much, but because in that stark white space, there were no titles, no roles, just a person. He opened his eyes when he heard the door. His gaze settled on me, startled at first, then softened. There was no panic, no expectation. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes," I replied. I pulled a chair closer and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "How are you?" "Better than this morning," he said. "The doctor says I need rest." We sat in silence for a moment, the steady hum of machines, footsteps in the hallway. I didn't know what I had come to say, but I knew I hadn't come to accuse him. I thought, "You wouldn't come," Richard said quietly. "I came," I replied without emphasizing the subject, "but not in the way you think." He looked up at the ceiling and took a deep breath. "I've thought a lot," he said, "in the past few hours." "Times like this usually make people think," I said. "I regret it," he said, turning to look at me. "Not just because everything fell apart, but because I thought I could control everything. I was wrong. I looked at him without avoiding his gaze. I know. I don't expect you to come back, he said quickly, as if afraid I might misunderstand. I know, that's over. I exhaled, relieved by those words. Yes, I said, it's over. There were no pleas to return, no late promises, just the bare acknowledgement of someone who had reached the end of a life built on lies and realized it led nowhere. Are you happy? Richard asked very softly. The question came unexpectedly, but it didn't upset me. I thought of gentle sunlight in the morning, of coffee by the window, of Samuel in the way he never rushed to take up my space. I'm at peace, I said, and that's enough. Richard closed his eyes. I didn't know what he was thinking, and I didn't need to know. I stood up. I'll let you rest, I said. The kids are outside. He nodded. Thank you for coming. I didn't reply. I just smiled very faintly and turned away. When the door closed behind me, I knew that was the last time I would step into the role of his past. There was nothing left to say. Out in the hallway, Lauren stood up when she saw me. She didn't come closer. She just looked at me, as if waiting for a signal. I nodded slightly. Not reconciliation, but acceptance that we had passed through the same pain in different ways. Thank you, Lauren said. Just one word. I nodded again. Take care of the girl, I said. She needs stability. Lauren nodded, her eyes reddening. I turned to the girl. You have beautiful eyes, I said. She looked surprised, then smiled shyly. That was enough. When I left the hospital, I paused outside for a moment and took a deep breath of the evening air. I called Samuel. I'm done, I said. I'm okay. I'm on my way, he replied. No rush, take your time. I ended the call and walked slowly toward the parking lot. No resentment, no clinging. The past had knocked one last time, and I had opened the door, not to go back, but to see it out. As I drove home, the street lights came on one by one, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was no longer carrying unanswered questions. I didn't need validation from my former life. I didn't need a dramatic ending. I only needed acceptance, and I had it. For the first time in many years, I felt truly free. The following spring arrived more gently than I expected. There was no grand moment marking it, no bells announcing a new beginning, just mornings with earlier sunlight, new buds appearing on the trees in the yard, and a sense of peace as I opened the windows and let the breeze flow through a house that now bore my own imprint. Samuel and I didn't talk much about big plans. We sat together at the kitchen table, spread out an old map, and marked a few places we wanted to visit when the weather warmed. A small coastal town he had once mentioned. A historic city I had always been curious about. No packed schedules, no long-term promises, just plans enough to make us smile when we thought about them. I liked the way Samuel asked for my opinion, listened, then nodded slowly, as if every choice deserved consideration. I no longer had to squeeze myself into someone else's plans. I was a companion, not someone walking behind. On weekends, my children and grandchildren came over more often. We cooked together, laughter filling the newly painted kitchen. I hung my paintings, placed green plants on the windowsills, replaced the sofa with a color I loved. The house was no longer a place that stored old compromises. It became a space shaped by choices I made with my own hands. Every corner told a new story, not loud, not showy, but warm enough to make people want to stay. Some afternoons, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the wind move through the leaves. I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. Silence was no longer a frightening void, but a place where I could rest. I knew how to brew a cup of tea just the way I liked it, when to go out and see others, and when to stay in. I didn't need anyone to fill my time. I just needed time lived at the right rhythm. Sometimes I looked back on the journey, from the moment I stood frozen in the company lobby, hearing someone else called by my title, to the night I changed the locks and told my children the truth, to the honest meeting with the other woman, to the day I signed the divorce papers and the first morning I woke up to a life no longer defined by marriage. I didn't romanticize the pain. I simply placed it where it belonged in memory, as pieces that had completed their purpose and no longer needed to be carried in my pocket every day. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't don't trust anyone, but don't lose yourself. Self-respect isn't loud. It shows up in small decisions, knowing when to say no, refusing to compromise with what hurts you, having the courage to stand upright before the truth. Identity isn't a label attached to a role. It's the inner feeling of living in alignment with your values, whether you're beside someone or alone. I am enough, even on my own, but I am also open enough to welcome the kind presence of another. Samuel walks beside me, not leading, not pulling me along. He walks with me, and that is enough. When we talk about the future, they aren't promises that make me lose the present, but plans that allow the present to be cherished more deeply. One morning, I hung a newly taken family photo on the wall. My children, my grandchildren, smiles that needed no explanation. I stepped back and looked at the house as a whole. The light fell in the right places. Nothing was perfect, but everything was real. I realized my new life hadn't begun on the day of the divorce, nor when I met Samuel. It began the moment I chose myself, and it continues every day I hold that choice steady. A new life doesn't announce itself loudly. It opens quietly when we stop being afraid. I don't know what challenges lie ahead, but I know I will face them with steadier feet, a wider heart, and a simple belief that I deserve my own peace. If you've walked with me all the way to these final lines, I want you to know that your presence is not small. Somewhere out there, you may be listening to this story on a quiet evening or in the middle of a long, thoughtful day, and that's enough for us to meet in the same emotional rhythm. Where are you listening from? What city or country? Please tell me, so I can feel how far this journey has reached you. If, in the pages of life I've just shared, there was a moment that made you pause, nod, or see yourself reflected there, please leave a comment, even just one sentence. I read every word with gratitude. And if you feel this story has given you a little warmth, a little courage to choose yourself, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in future stories. Life doesn't end when we lose something. It truly begins when we dare to live in alignment with our values. Thank you for listening and for being here.